Constitution Day in the Capitol. I apologize for the delay. We've had a 5-minute delay here based on the fact that a lot of our friends have been held up at security. My sincere apologies for that. However, we're going to go ahead and kick this off because I know we have a lot of friends at home who are watching this on live stream, and we don't want to hold them up, and hopefully we get our friends who are second security up here for the rest of the program. My name is Marshall Wilson. I'm a delegate from South Berkeley County, District 60. I'm the only independent serving in the legislature, and I'm currently running as your independent candidate for governor. To my left is Dr. Haynes. He'll stand up in just a moment. He's going to be our context presenter. He's going to present the historical, philosophical, moral context of basically each of the other presentations that you'll see. It should be really interesting. We've got Pastor Bill Harmon, who is going to provide the invocation, also the blessing and closing at the end. We have Mr. Ernesto Patiño. I'm not going to really go into who he is or what he does very much because his story is a comprehensive, integral whole that needs to be told by him. But he is my good friend from Venezuela, and he has some interesting information and admonitions for us. Mr. Robert Mooney, a good friend of mine from grad school, who is, well, I don't really know what he does now that he's finished grad school, but he does some interesting things. And he's an analyst, and Mr. Mooney is going to present the Federalist side of the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist debate. Delegate Patrick McGeehan, who I assume you all know and probably are as big a fans of him as I am, will be here shortly. He's down in his office right now, but he will be here shortly, and he's going to take the Anti-Federalist position. Those of you who know Delegate McGeehan will not be surprised at all that he's taking that position, but he'll be here shortly. And we have Dr. Smoot, who is going to present his specialty. He is a West Virginia native, Ripley. I forgot to mention, Dr. Haynes, that of course you used to be a Charleston City Councilman, and you are a Charleston native. My apologies, I meant to mention that. And Dr. Haynes is the chair of the government department at Patrick Henry College in Purcellville, Virginia. Dr. Smoot is going to present the foundation and the Constitution of West Virginia. Of course, most of us here have some idea at least of what the historical context was of that, so you know that it's going to be fascinating. And then ultimately, we're going to end up with retired Army First Sergeant Barry Holstein, who's going to discuss with us, basically, from my perspective, how now shall we live. So once the information has been given to us, we understand who we are, where we came from, and have some approximation of where we're heading. How should a free West Virginian respond to that information? And that's going to be from First Sergeant Barry Holstein. If you will, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pastor Harmon, and I'm going to get out of the way. Thank you very much.
The Bible says in Psalm 127:1, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Could we pray? Eternal Father, we come to you as thankful people. We are thankful for your love, thankful for your mercy, and thankful for your kindness toward us. Father, we're also thankful for the many blessings that you have given us. Blessings of health, blessings of prosperity and freedom. We have come with a grateful heart, knowing that your hand has been upon us as a nation and a people to guide and direct us. Through miracles and your favor, you led our forefathers, and through their sacrifice and your blessing, we live in a nation where the government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. Throughout our history, we truly have been a people who have enjoyed the blessing of liberty, and for that we thank you. Today, Lord, we ask that your presence be manifest in this room as we gather in your name to commemorate this Constitution Day and the document that George Washington declared as little short of a miracle. May we remember that it was nothing less than your hand that brought about what we celebrate here today. May our ears be open to hear and our hearts be ready to receive what you have for us. We pray, Lord, that we would be stirred to action and that our wills would be strengthened for the road ahead. Bless those in attendance today here in this place and those watching by live stream, and may each speaker experience a special touch from you. We ask this all in the name of your Son and our Savior, Jesus the Christ. Amen.
little bit awkward for me because I normally don't stay in one place. I move all over the place, and so I'll try to stay back here. And the other thing is my voice carries so strongly that I usually have to use mic, but we'll stay with this. Thank you for inviting me here to speak on Constitution Day. It's an honor. It's great to be back in my home state, my home city. As Delegate Wilson said, I was born and raised here. And I tell my students that West Virginia has the most beautiful state capital in the country. Now, almost all of them disagree with me because they think their state capital is the best, but arguably this is a beautiful, beautiful building. And so I am the chairman, as Doug Wilson said, from the Government Department of Patiño College in Virginia. We're about 45 minutes out of downtown D.C., and that means we're either 45 minutes drive into D.C. or 3 hours drive into D.C., depending on what time of day it is. So you don't ever want to get in the traffic at D.C. because you just sit. So anyway, so if you might allow me, I'm going to give you just a quick, shameless plug for Patrick Henry, as I do anytime I talk. So Patrick Henry is a classical liberal arts college, and everybody, a lot of schools say they're classical liberal arts, but Patrick Henry is really a classical liberal arts. So if you want to know about the history of the country, you want to know about the preparations of life and understanding the Constitution, all those things, just give you a brief. We have everybody in every student, no matter what they major in, takes a core. And in our core, you will take 2 semesters of American history, you'll take 2 semesters of world civilization, and you'll take 2 semesters of Freedom's Foundations. So you're going to get a solid background of who we were, where we came from, and how we got to here. So just give you that. Also, we have probably one of the best internship programs in the world, in the country at least. We are so close to D.C. that we have internships at all the major. We have interns in the White House. We had interns in the major agencies, FCC, Department of Education, Department of Energy. We have our interns at all the think tanks, Heritage, AEI, all those kinds of places, and then our interns intern on the Hill with the senators and the congressmen on a regular basis. And part of Ph.D. is we not only train you academically, but we require you to do an apprenticeship. And that's what our internships are. So you're not only going to go learn from academics, you're also going to go do. And you're going to get, because that really increases the education if we tell you and then you go do it. So it's required. Also, we're probably one of the premier pre-law programs. We're sort of quiet. Most people don't know that, but we're one of the premier pre-law programs in the country. And just to give you an example, our students rank highest in the nation in the LSAT exam. Now, the LSAT exam is it's a preparation test to get you into law school. And we rank highest in the nation, and that's including every college and university. So we're talking Harvard, Yale, any of those. We rank higher, our students do, on those LSAT tests. Also, if you're interested in forensics debate, you want to run for office someday, I got potential congressmen and senators and presidents in here probably. So our moot court team has won 12 out of the last 15 national titles. So we really prepared you. So if you're looking for a good college that will prepare you for life, Patrick Henry. Okay, that is, the commercial's over. And now we go on. Coming back home, in my office, I was thinking about Charleston and some of the things, and this is just for old people. Anybody, how many of you are actually from Charleston? Anybody? Okay, well, Ripley's close enough. So you can, just a couple things to flash in my mind real quickly. The Diamond Department Store at Christmas time. That was a magical place. You stand outside those windows and trains were running all through the windows and animated elves were building things, and you could just, I remember standing in the snow sometimes just staring at those windows like, wow, this is getting any nicer than this. And then in the summertime, this is going to be for those who really knew, the A&W drive-in on, I think it was Central Avenue on the west side. You drive in there with your car, park under a canopy. They'd come out and take your order, and then they would come out with trays, and you had to put your window down and just sort of hook into it. And they had the big glass mugs full of A&W root beer, and then the top fourth would be frozen foam root beer on top of that, and it was spectacular. Anyway, enough of that. Let's move on to what we're here about, and that is to honor the Constitution. All right. The writers of the Constitution weren't perfect men. And the Constitution is not a perfect document. Now, before you rush up here and drag me out and throw me out of the building, hear me out. Not perfect. But the founders are truly great men. They're flawed, just like we were flawed. And so don't put them on pedestals. No, they made mistakes, yeah. Who wouldn't make mistakes? But they were flawed, but they were great men. And I will say, as much, they were exceptional men. There's a lot of attempt today to malign our history, to malign our heritage, to discredit our founders. And no, they didn't do everything right. And they didn't perfectly understand the unfolding of America, how we were going to develop and grow. But my question is, could you or anyone else have done any better than they did? I don't think so. The problem is that we try to bring those men into today's world and say, look, they're not perfect here, they're not perfect there, they're not. You can't do that. They were born and raised at a different time. And to understand them, we've got to look at them through that time. Just like people in the future will look back at us, and if they try to put us in their time frame, we're not going to look very good. But in their time frame, these men were exceptional men. In fact, they were at the time radicals, free thinkers. They were cutting-edge thinkers. Very few men at the time. Think about that first. We're going to create a country that's self-governing. That had never been done before. In fact, most people at that time said men could not self-govern. You had to have a king, you had to have a dictator, you had to have somebody. You couldn't self-govern, not in a large scale. And these guys set up and said, yeah, I think we can. We're going to have to put this together. We can do this. So they were truly exceptional, no doubt about that. And in my opinion, these exceptional men created for us a Constitution that is man's best ever attempt at providing a system of government for a free and self-governing people. No one has done better. So we can attack it if we want. No one's done any better, ever, anywhere in the world. And let me give you a quote from Samuel Huntington. He was governor of Connecticut at the time. And I quote, "A new event in the modern history of mankind. Heretofore, most governments have been formed by tyrants and imposed on mankind by force. Never before did a people, in the time of peace and tranquility, meet together by their representatives, and with calm deliberation frame for themselves a system of government." Never been done before. All right, first let's consider what's the purpose of the Constitution. We can draw our Constitution, we can draw from we can go all the way back to the Magna Carta, 1215 England. And from political thinkers such as Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu and many, many others. But what is a Constitution? For our purposes, we're going to say a definition for it. Constitution is at the fundamental level, it is a plan for governing a social order. So a Constitution should empower government at certain predetermined areas. It should limit government in any other areas. And it should lay out the rules for political, economic, and social order. From that, government can create policy and laws that are developed by using the rules the Constitution lays out. That's what a Constitution does. The United States Constitution does exactly that. Now, we say that the Constitution is a limiting document. What was it designed to limit? What was this Constitution designed to limit? It's designed to limit the government, and in most cases, not the people. There are a few things in there, but it's designed to control the government, not the people. Specifically, it was designed which government? The Constitution. The Constitution was designed to limit the national government, not the state governments. It didn't control the state government. The Constitution doesn't try to. It's trying to control the national government, and that only. That's what our Constitution set out to do. So let's go back and do a little bit of the philosophical part. This will be the theory behind things. We'll get to that, get to other things later. But let's look just very quickly at some political philosophers of the time and how our founders borrowed those ideas and then actually transformed them into a real document that has created the government that we have. So let's look at Thomas Hobbes first. Thomas Hobbes was a political philosopher. He lived from 1588 to 1679, and his premier book was Leviathan, 1651. Hobbes lays out what mankind's like and why we need government. So Hobbes says that in the natural state, man is motivated by self-interest, self-preservation, and he's absolutely free. God is out of the picture. Hobbes has no use for God whatsoever. But self-interested, self-preservation, I think we can, okay. And man is always looking to gain good things and avoid bad things. Okay, I think we can agree with that, right? That's pretty much the case. Or at least for me, I don't like the bad things. I try to keep away from those. The good things, yes. He needs security, and he's got to have protection of his interests. But the problem is, in the state of nature, every man is against every other man. So, life is hard, according to Hobbes, life is hard, cold, dangerous, lonely, and most importantly, very short. Because you may be the big guy today, but somebody comes along with a bigger club than you the next day, and it's very, very hard life. So the purpose for government, according to Hobbes, the purpose for government is to keep you alive and to protect your stuff. And as long as the government does that, according to Hobbes, you have to obey completely. You cannot challenge the government in any way, shape, or form. If it's keeping you alive and protecting your stuff, you have to obey. Only, now, at that point, kings sort of liked him, right? So when they read to the king, yeah, they've got to obey. I like this Hobbes. So, and Hobbes says that only at the point of death can you disobey. Because at that point, your chances in the state of nature are better than your chances in the government. So, at that point. Now, the problem is that about this time, the middle class is beginning to rise. We've got shopkeepers, we've got things starting to come. There's a middle class forming in Europe and around where all this was. And so middle class was like, yeah, we're not, Hobbes is all right, but because absolutely obey, never ever challenge. So then comes John Locke, and hopefully you've heard Locke more, probably even than Hobbes, but Locke lives from 1632 to 1704. We're getting close now to that 1776 area. Okay, so Locke says, he writes in his main writing was the Two Treatises of Government, and he wrote that in 1689, and he is basically the founder of classical liberalism, which isn't the liberalism we know today. Classical liberalism looks more like conservatism. So, now he comes along and he says a little bit differently. He says, no, there are a priori, or inalienable, or natural rights, and among them are life, liberty, and property. And then he realizes he's got to anchor those three in something other than men, because that shifts and there's no real foundation there. There's something. So he says God gave us those. Nothing to do with men. Life, liberty, property, God did that. All right, but then Locke says apparently God did all that, got tired, and walked off. God is no longer involved with Locke. So, now, listen to what he says government should be. And see if this doesn't sound fairly, you've heard this before. Government should be by the consent of the governed. Government should be limited in its role and purpose. Government must be representative. You have to have majority rule, but minority rule have to be protected. There's a separation of power with checks and balances, and individual rights are guaranteed usually by a written constitution. Sound fairly, you may have heard that in history classes, things like that, yeah. So there's been an attempt, especially in the modern time, for scholars to say, yeah, well, Locke really wasn't all that influential in the American founding. Really? Is that the way the founders saw that? Let me just give you a quote from Thomas Jefferson. I think he was involved in the founding, right? Thomas Jefferson says, and I quote, of Locke, of John Locke, he was one of the 3 greatest men who ever lived without exception. So it sounds like one of the main founders thought Locke was a pretty good guy, and he was listening to Locke. And if you look at our Constitution, it sounds a lot like what Locke said. So they pulled a lot of information from Locke, and there are many, many others we just don't have time to get into that we could look at as far as the philosophical background. Leading up through and throughout the Revolutionary War, Americans began to see God's hand upon them. And they felt that God had providentially put them here at this time to build this government, and that he had great plans for America. So just a couple of quotes to sort of back that up. Thomas Paine, in his pamphlet Common Sense, said, and I quote, "America is humanity's last hope of liberty." Jim Winthrop, the former governor of the colonies, said, "For we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all the people will be upon us." Those are pretty bold statements, aren't they? From a country at that time which was a third world country. Hadn't had any of the development that Europe had had. This was still backwoods. And yet we begin to see that, no, we're going to be different. Many Americans begin to see themselves different, even as possibly exceptional. We were going to show the world how far a free people under God could go. Now, let's look at some history leading up to the Constitution. And you're all aware of the, let me take this off so that I don't run terribly. You gotta remember, I'm a professor. I can go and go and go and go. All right. And I will stop when we have to, because we can take, it's a very big subject. We can take weeks, months of this. And I'm willing, but you're probably not. So, all right. The United States wins the Revolutionary War, and immediately we establish the Constitution, right? Hopefully you're saying no. No. We didn't sign the Constitution until September 17th, 1787, and then it wasn't ratified until March 4th, 1789. But the Revolutionary War had caused a problem that there had to be a plan of federation for the individual states to survive. So there was necessarily a government that had to be performed in it. Just remember, though, the founders didn't trust the government at all. So before the Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, and the real title is the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And it was a very loose document, but it was a very restrictive document on the federal government, the national government. So the main points, and well, this is important for how we got the United States Constitution. The main point is, it creates no executive. There is no leader, and it creates a very weak Congress. Each individual state is absolutely sovereign and independent from every other state. Every state had one vote in the Congress, the Articles of Congress. Every state had one vote. And it took 9 votes out of 13 to make any changes, which means a supermajority to make any changes. And if you were going to try to amend the articles, you had to have a unanimous vote. In politics, have you ever seen unanimous anything? Really tough to ever change the articles. They never were changed until they were done away with. The Congress had no power to tax, might be a good thing. The Congress had no power to tax, and it didn't have any power to enforce any of its decisions. Congress was responsible for the national defense, but no money to pay the troops. So, and think about it at the time. Here we are, 13 colonies, 13 states now, and to the north was Canada and Great Britain just rubbing her hands saying, as soon as you fall on your face, we're coming right back in and taking you back over again. To the south, we had Florida, which was Spain at the time, and And Spain's looking and saying, boy, that Georgia looks really appealing to us. To the west, we've got France and the Native American Indians pressing. So we're three sides pressing. And how many troops do you think the U.S. Army had at that time to protect all those borders? Less than 1,000 troops. And we weren't paying them. See what kind of precarious position we were in? If it hadn't been for a providential hand from God, what are the chances of that country surviving? So, and every state under the Articles could negotiate its own separate treaties with other countries independent of the other states. So there's competitions going on, all this kind of stuff moving around, very, very difficult. The National Congress asked the states for $13 million to run the entire national government a year. Wish we could do that now, right? $13 million to run the entire government. But they didn't even get enough revenue coming in to pay the debt, to pay the interest on the national debt we had from winning the Revolutionary War. In fact, anybody from North Carolina or Georgia? Good. Okay, in fact, North Carolina and Georgia didn't give 1 cent to the national government from the period of 1781 to 1786. No money whatsoever. So clearly the Articles of Confederation weren't working. Something had to be done, but everybody didn't trust government. They didn't want to change anything. But the country's in pretty dire straits. We've got a Congress that can make rules, we can't enforce them. They can't pay their army, and it becomes pretty scary. But 1786, something happens that changes everybody's mindset. We've got to do something different. Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shay had been a sort of a hero in the Revolutionary War. Okay? And remember, the national government had no money. So what the national government said was, if you will go fight, we'll pay you after the war's over. And you cannot, if you will fight for us, you cannot lose your farms because you're out fighting. Well, we win the war is over, the government can't pay you, although it promised. And the big landowners who had sold the farms to the farmers were taking the farms back, forcing them out because they weren't making their payments. So they were foreclosing and reassessing. So what does Daniel Shay do? He rounds up 2,000 farmers in western Massachusetts, and they go on a rampage. They are trying to force Massachusetts government to stop the foreclosure processes because they've been promised it wouldn't be that way. Well, this panics the governor and all of the people in Massachusetts. You've got 2,000 men running around here. And so they immediately call to the Congress and say, send in the army, we've got to help, we've got to have help. What's Congress say? What army? You're on your own. So the governor gets with the wealthy landowners and they pay for put together an army that's paid by them, and they eventually suppress and put down Shays' Rebellion. But that scares all 13 states pretty badly. That puts enough pressure on, okay, we've got to do something now. We're losing this. We've got to do something. So, delegates from several states met in Annapolis, Maryland, in September of 1786, at a tavern. I told you they weren't perfect men. So they met at a tavern, and this convention, this Annapolis Convention, was actually called the Meeting of Commissioners to Remedy Defects of the Federal Government. The unanimous decision from that meeting was that there should be a Constitutional Congress called in Philadelphia. Now we're moving toward that. So, the official call for the Constitutional Congress comes out February 21st, 1787. And everyone was supposed to meet, you were supposed to send your delegates in May to Philadelphia. Now, those opposed to any change refused to go. We won't have any part. Rhode Island even refused the entire state. They wouldn't even send a delegation, which, this is important, because how many votes you have to amend the Articles? unanimous. Rhode Island didn't show up, so there could be no change. Now, looking back, was that a great strategy for the people who were opposed? Looking back, we're probably glad they didn't show up, right? Because we ended up getting the Constitution. But was it a good strategy for them? Clinton Rossiter, a political science scholar, said of those who refused to participate, had they participated and represented probably the majority view of Americans at the time, the Constitution would look very, very different than what came out. So there's a lesson to learn here as we close this section. There's a lesson to learn. Too often, we are prone to throw up our hands and walk away instead of digging in and defending the things that we believe in. As in sports, as it is in all of life, if you leave the field, who wins? The other side. Those who would degrade and weaken our Constitution, and believe me, they're there, are more than willing to watch you disengage and walk away. You think you've shown your, I won't have any part of this, I'll just walk away. Yeah, you can. But then you'll live under what happens next. So you need to be very, very careful about that. Let me borrow a quick line out of the Bible if I can. Ephesians 6, 13b and 14a. Having done all to stand firm, stand. We must stand for what we believe in. We must protect what we believe in. And we've got to be willing to take it day in and day out. Because the other side never stops. They'll never quit. And we can't just pick our marbles and go home. There's too much at stake. So we have to fight. Let me give you, in closing in this section, we have to throw Plato in there somewhere, right? I'm going to paraphrase Plato. He said, those who are too smart, if you're too smart, those who are too smart to engage in politics are punished by being governed by those who are dumber than them. Thank you. We'll talk more in the next section. Federalists should be up. Anybody that needs singing, we can have a song or waiting for them. Federalists, anti-federalists. I don't see either one of them here. He was right here, yes. All right. Well, we don't want to waste time. So what I'm going to do is jump on to section, my next section, and then I'll stop immediately. Okay? Is that fair? There. So we just don't have to stare at each other. Well, it's much better. I don't mind staring at you, but I know what I look like, so that's not going to be pleasant for you guys. All right. This section, what we want to do is talk about the actual Constitutional Convention and how we got the Constitution. Because of the time constraints, all I'm going to do is just hit examples of things. There's a lot of material here. We are blessed, and I think it's providentially so. James Madison took just extensive notes on everything that happened in those months. And so we have a really good understanding of what actually occurred, because he just took copious notes on every single thing. So, according to the official call, the Constitutional Convention was set to open on Monday, March 4th, 1787, at Philadelphia. But there wasn't a quorum. Part of the problem, again, I told you, the United States at that point in time was a backwoods country. And the roads weren't like our interstate system. They were mud roads, and in the winter, sometimes they were totally impassable. And in the spring, at this time, very hard to get places. So people were coming, they just couldn't get there by March 4th. So there's no, May 4th. There's no, did I say March 4th? It's May 4th, when we wanted them there. So, finally, on May 25th, there's a quorum. And they can start the deliberations. Now, that runs from all summer long, debating and arguing and trying to come up with plans to deal with all of this. That runs the entire summer until September, before it's ever finalized. Some of the brightest minds ever there, but back and forth, back and forth. Remember, there was never anything done like this before. This is all brand new stuff. We're going to develop a country by sitting around and talking about it. It didn't just happen. All of those issues had to be dealt with, beat out. And as in any group, how many times do you think everybody agrees? Never. I've been on a lot of boards and panels, whether they're in the political side or on the, even at church, guys. Get in a room with a bunch of deacons and nobody agrees with anything. So it's an interesting time. Are you guys ready to go? One of the presenters, I don't know. Yeah, see if you can track them in here. Okay. So, some of the first things that were done right off the bat. George Washington was unanimously elected to be the presiding officer. And they decided that each state could have one vote. You can bring as many delegates as you want. But all your delegates had to get together and agree because you only had one vote. So each state had one vote. Now here's an interesting part. Any delegate at any time could call for reconsideration of any issue that had already been settled. Can you imagine the chaos and confusion that caused? You think you've got something finally locked down, you voted on, it's over, and it only takes one person to say, let's talk about that again. And the whole thing starts up again. So it's very tough to try to get everything lined up, because as soon as you start putting the package together, I want to go back and talk about the first one first. So this goes on and on and on. And remember, it's hot in Philadelphia in the summertime, and there's no air conditioning, and so they're there just beating us out every day. And the fascinating thing is they would meet all day long, and then at night, they would go out and write back home. The Federalist Papers were written in the evenings between all of these sessions. These were exceptional, man. And the writings in the Federalist Paper were unbelievably good. So strong, so thought out. They've been working all day long on all kinds of things. Do you have your counterpart?
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Until 11 o'clock.
No, 10:45. You are absolutely right. My fault, not yours. But if you're ready, we are ready. And then I'll jump back up afterwards. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys now. All right, we'll pick up there, and what happens at the Constitutional Convention.
Give me 1 minute.
All right. All right. I read the time wrong. I'm sorry. So I'll take the blame. As we just go on a little bit more, Thomas Jefferson originally is totally opposed to this convention. I don't know if you know that or not. Thomas Jefferson was totally opposed to the convention. He wanted to keep the articles, and now he warms up to it. But another one, Patrick Henry, the namesake of our college. Patrick Henry was strongly against this convention. In fact, he said he smelt a rat. He said, who authorized them to speak in the language of we the people instead of we the states? They have no right to do this. And he never warmed up to the issue, at least until the Constitution actually came out. You guys are ready to take over. Do it? Okay, this is my time was off on this, so I don't blame you guys. So anyway, last thing, this is we want just a little bit longer. Let's stop just for a second. you read about the Constitution, right? You have in your history classes, read about, and it's just, yeah, we came to a Constitution, we got a Constitution. Do you realize the work, the pressure those men were under? They were doing something that had never been done before. There was no model. Other constitutions have been made because they look at either but they look at another constitution and say, well, let's just borrow this, let's do that. None of that. This has never been done before, and they've got to try to figure out, reading the philosophies of Locke and Hobbes and Montesquieu and on, how do you take those thoughts and turn them into a government? How? It boggles your mind that you could even think about, okay, we're going to take these new thoughts that no one's ever had, no one's ever done this before, it's never been done, and we're going to take all of this, and in 3 or 4 months, by sitting around talking and debating, we're going to come up with probably one of the most perfect documents man has ever written. The founders were exceptional. Very, very exceptional. All right, so, because this is all brand new. Okay, you both ready? My fault, not. All right, I'm going to stop right there, and we'll pick this up again very quickly. Sorry, guys. I read this wrong too.
Okay, so my name is Delegate McGeehan. I'm from the 1st District. Got notified that by my good friend from Ripley County here, who's running for governor, was going to have a celebration of Constitution Day. And you don't find too many celebrations of Constitution Days much anymore in modern society. I don't think many people actually know that Constitution Day actually exists. So when he called me up and asked me to come down and be a part of it, you know, I was sort of flattered, and I was glad that someone was taking the time out of his schedule to perform such an act. So what is Constitution Day exactly, and what should it mean to us today? Of course, I think we all in here probably have a great reverence for the Constitution. But I think very few people today might grasp that the convention at Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was by far a unanimous sort of we all get along event, and that produced this magnificent document in solidarity afterwards. There were fierce debates that raged during this convention in 1787 and in the months and years afterwards. And so I was asked to sort of give play devil's advocate and represent what were known as the anti-federalist position, who were mainly men who were greatly concerned that the new Constitution, and I would say the Constitution of today, was actually the second Constitution to our country. And I'm sure many of you in this audience, who appear to be very well educated, could guess what the first real sort of Constitution, if you want to call it such, was. And that, of course, was the Articles of Confederation. So we might ask ourselves today, in the 21st century, why would since we've been largely governed under this constitutional document that was ultimately ratified and put into place after the Philadelphia Convention for 200-something years, why would it be relevant today to discuss the anti-federalists who opposed this measure and discuss the preceding sort of document that had formed the first national government, namely the Articles of Confederation? I think maybe we should start off with what exactly were the goals of the American Revolution to begin with. And I think when I think about that, I think of two main goals, really, and they were both achieved. One was to overthrow British rule and essentially overthrow British rule of the colonies, expel the British redcoats, and win the American Revolutionary War. And also, though, I think a secondary goal of the Articles of Confederation was to present an obstacle and inhibit a homegrown, centralized version of a British Parliament and a king. And so I believe those two goals were achieved by the Articles of Confederation. And if you look at what historians in the mainstream, I'm going to use that term a little bit widely and diverse, I know I'm generalizing, but in the mainstream, the consensus is, and what is usually taught is, there were severe problems that were just too great to overcome with the Articles of Confederation. And I will consent to there were some problems. Namely, I think one problem was the requirement that a unanimous vote was be taken to carry the day on any new proposed law. That was probably something that could have been revised. However, I think they were largely successful, the articles in general. And so, by the time we get to Philadelphia, there are many delegates who show up at this convention with an understanding that a reformation to the Articles of Confederation is going to be the objective. And I think, I am sympathetic to the position, although I don't hold this position necessarily, but I am sympathetic to the position that there were very much different motives in the minds of some men, that was not the goal, even though some of those men explicitly stated that was the goal. And I think some of these motives was to immediately overhaul the Articles of Confederation, dismiss it, and insert a new, more powerful form of the national government, which is ultimately what happened in Philadelphia. And so the anti-federalists are relevant today because I think primarily, if you look back at some of the writings, and by the way, of course, the Federalist Papers are what normally historians or students of history are going to study. And they're praised for their prose and for their elegance and a number of other factors. And rightfully so. I mean, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were very good writers. But unfortunately, the Federalist Papers, when we look at them, and I forgot John Jay, but when we look at the Federalist Papers, there's a problem. They were less than true to what happened factually almost immediately after the Constitution was ratified. So there was a theme in the Federalist Papers that, no. The power of the states and the sovereignty of the different states will remain the same largely as it was under the Articles of Confederation. There is not going to be this great centralization. There is not going to be this great consolidation of power. And here's why. And they laid out all sorts of different reasons. I think, for instance, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, did want a stronger national government, even though his good friend Thomas Jefferson did not. Actually, I have quotes I jotted down from Jefferson. Two quotes, actually, on the Articles of Confederation. People don't know this. Thomas Jefferson. This is in 1787, in two different areas. One was a letter, and another was, I think, a note to himself. And here's two quotes from Thomas Jefferson on the Articles. This is 1787, very pertinent time frame. Wonderfully perfect instrument, considering the circumstances under which it was formed. That's Thomas Jefferson in reference to the Articles of Confederation. Here's a second quote. Without comparison, the best form of government existing or that ever did exist. And he's referencing, of course, the government underneath the Articles of Confederation. So when we get back to the Federalists and the Federalist Papers, even though the Constitution, these men largely knew that it was going to provide much more power to a centralized government, they billed it and sold it to the public at large as something that was going to do the opposite. Now, I will say this, James Madison was a very honorable man, and so after the ratification of the Constitution, he did try to carry out, okay, this is how we marketed and sold it to the public, so we should fulfill those promises and stick with the intention that it was sold as. The problem is, the other man, who's best known in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, did exactly the opposite. He sold the new Constitution as something that was never going to consolidate power, that was going to stick within the bounds of basically the Articles of Confederation with a few nuanced changes. And I'm very big in generalizing now. But as soon as it was ratified, and of course then he becomes the Secretary of Treasury under Washington's administration, he immediately dismisses everything he wrote in his Federalist Papers and went on the verge of trying to greatly expand federal power at the expense of a decentralized approach, which was the understanding is how the American states were going to move forward. So when we go to the Anti-Federalists, who were they? Well, I'm just going to talk about the Anti-Federalist Papers. And, you know, it's funny because we have the Federalist Papers, their collection, for a very long time. But it really wasn't until, I think, the 1960s when a full sort of compilation and collection of what we would call the Anti-Federalist Papers came to be published, largely because some of it was not a coordinated effort like the Federalist Papers were. And so you had, you know, they wrote under pseudonyms, you know, back then. So we had, I'll list off a few of the pseudonyms for some of these men that would be called anti-federalists who were writing and having their letters, the anti-federalist letters, published in the major newspapers in the various original states. Brutus was one. He was, Brutus is often, sometimes we don't even know what personality wrote these anti-federalist letters. Brutus, though, is attributed largely to maybe Robert Yates, who's a judge and a dissenting voice at the Philadelphia Convention. It could have been, Thomas Treadwell, I think, or John Williams. Could have been the identity behind Brutus. I like to focus on Cato, though, because Cato, the pseudonym of Cato's letters, not to be confused with the earlier Cato letters from the early 18th century, written in England by Thomas Gordon and I was a compatriot, his name escapes me now. There's I think Cato, his anti-federalist publications in some of these large American newspapers. I think the personality behind, historians largely think the personality behind him was New York Governor George Clinton, although that's not even confirmed. And then we have, of course, the last anti-federalist, most prominent, wrote under the name the Federal Farmer. And for a long time, historians thought that was Robert E. Lee's father, Richard Henry, like Horace Carey Lee. But I believe the consensus now is it could have possibly been Melvin Smith. So I won't bore you with those details anymore, but I want to explain why these men who wrote these letters, why they're relevant today, because they were very, very prophetic. These different anti-federalists who wrote these letters to express their views in opposition to a new, stronger federal government underneath the new Constitution, many of their predictions did come to pass. For instance, many of them argued that the text of the Constitution, regardless of what the Federalists were going to say, would never come to be, or would in fact be misconstrued. The necessary and proper clause. That was one huge objection that the anti-federalists had. The commerce clause, they said, would be greatly abused, misconstrued, regardless of what the Federalists would say. The commerce clause was vague and it would be misconstrued, and of course it has been. We won't, I'm sure many of you already know how that's been misconstrued. Some of it is so ripe with abuse, and you have to go to long lengths to figure out the logic of how these guys can get away with applying this commerce clause to basically mean that the federal government can do whatever they want with domestic policy. And the general welfare clause was another clause that they had, the anti-federalists had great concern with. They actually, according to Sentinel, one of the pseudonyms the anti-federalists wrote underneath, he quotes, "Whatever taxes, duties, and excises that they may deem requisite for the general welfare may be imposed on the citizens of these states." And that was Sentinel, an anti-federalist writing. I believe that was published in 1788. Might be wrong on the date. So very prophetic. But apart from taxation, the anti-federalists saw the general welfare clause could be construed to establish a plenitude of new powers for the new general government, for the new national government. And so these men, when they wrote, they shouldn't be ignored because their judgments are relevant because they are so accurate. I'll just wrap up with one great concern the anti-federalists had, and that is on executive power underneath a president. And to simplify it, they believed that establishing a chief executive with the powers invested underneath this new Constitution with this new chief executive would eventually lead to something like a monarch with standing armies and with the militias essentially being confiscated or essentially assimilated into these standing professional armies, and then basically that process going forward would mimic what the British had already done. And I know I'm simplifying some of those arguments, but they're well thought out, and Cato's letters, for instance, especially. And I think that's been played out. No, Cato, the guy writing underneath the pseudonym of Cato, I think it was George Clinton, governor of New York, was wrong for quite some time into the 20th century when it finally played out. In the first, if we understand that the Congress has not declared war since early 1942, actually. I don't think anybody in this room would dispute that we haven't fought a war since the early 40s. If there's been no declaration of war for the Congress, right? And we saw the militias overtaken in the early 20th century, beginning with the Spanish-American War. The first sort of foreign entanglement that we really got ourselves into. And that's when it was recognized that the militias needed, the state's militias needed to serve abroad as part of a regular force. And they could no longer just be allowed to carry out and be limited to the duties prescribed to them in the new Constitution. And now we have the National Guard structure, which, may on text say that the governor is the commander-in-chief of our West Virginia National Guard forces. But in reality, anytime the feds want to federalize them and send them over into endless wars that are very expensive in blood and treasure, they can do so arbitrarily at will. And so that's why I think the Anti-Federalists at large are very relevant today. I think without the Anti-Federalists, by the way, we would not have the Bill of Rights. And I think that's one, even though they lost the cause of preventing this consolidation, the Bill of Rights largely came to pass to at least silence the Anti-Federalist critics, or possibly some saw that there was some truth to the arguments they were putting forward. And I think that Madison was wrong in this regard. Madison, remember, he didn't really want a Bill of Rights, right? He said, well, if it's not in the Constitution enumerated, we don't need a Bill of Rights. But I think that if we did not have the Anti-Federalist critics who finally won their Bill of Rights with the first Congress who started proposing these amendments, namely the 10th Amendment, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, then is anybody in here really think that if we did not have a Bill of Rights, we didn't have a First Amendment or a Second Amendment, that we would still have the freedoms to enjoy that those amendments sort of surface around? No, because the public knows they can point to something, and something with authority, and say, you can't do that. It says that right there. The Second Amendment. It says that. And the average guy down know that. So I think the Anti-Federalists did have the last laugh, so to speak, in this debate. But they're worth studying. They're worth going over, and they're very relevant today because many of their predictions did come to pass. So that's all I have to say about the matter. I do, though, think that the Constitution, as written, is the best form of government in the world. Even though, I am more of an anti-federalist type of guy, I do believe that the Constitution, if we can stick to the original intent, is a way to hopefully maybe fight back and use as a very large authority, a measure of authority to point to try to reverse course on the decline of the American Republic and Western civilization in general. So I'll leave you with that. I appreciate Delegate Wilson for inviting me down here to speak. I hope I at least added a little bit of value. But I'll turn it over to someone who's probably much smarter than me and is going to point out all of my errors. So thank you very much.
people of West Guaido, Virginia, for being so welcoming throughout my entire stay here. I've been here for a few hours now, and I landed in last night, and I just want to say that you have treated this Californian living in exile with an incredible amount of kindness and respect. And the fact that you guys can openly carry guns in the state is kind of, it's anathema to me. But I have nothing but respect for this state. It's a beautiful place, and thank you for that. My co-host here said something originally in the start that was quite interesting. He said that he wanted to pay reverence to the Constitution, and that today, Constitution Day, is a day in which we all should pay reverence to the Constitution and its values. And I'd just like to speak for a minute or two about that. So, my last name is a body part. But what that does not necessarily belie is the fact that I actually my family comes from Ireland. We would be nothing without this country, to put it plainly. We were fishermen for 800 years. There's a bar in Washington, D.C. that still serves the same liquor that my ancestors were drinking 800 years ago. It's called O'Sullivan's. It's a great place. And they would go in on the docks, and they would drink that little whiskey. Without this country, I would not, and the Constitution and the values that we honor today, I would have been a fisherman in County Louth. Today, I have a master's degree, and my grandmother and grandfather didn't have a high school diploma. That could only happen here, and the only way that could have ever occurred was based on the values and the constitutional values that we are honoring today here in the West Virginia State Capitol. My ancestors have fought in most of America's wars, stretching from the Revolution to Vietnam, and I've had good friends of mine go over to Iraq and Afghanistan as well, Marshall being one of them. Good men have died for these values. And that is something that we must carry forward every single day when we pay tribute to the Constitution, but especially today on this day, given what we are here to represent. So the history of democracy is very long, and unfortunately, it is very bloody. We are sort of spoiled for choice and spoiled for history in the United States. We have a history of a democracy that, by and large, has worked out relatively well for us. However, that's not always necessarily true. The Greeks tried democracy. The phrase democracy comes from ancient Greece. It's demos kratis, and the will of the people. It did not necessarily work out very well for them, if you have understood whether it was the Peloponnesian Wars and all of these other types of clashes that occurred. This concept of direct democracy was not, it devolved into anarchy in short order. And their students, the Romans, attempted it, and it sort of ended in the opposite way. It ended in a totalitarian dictatorship for Rome. Even today, democracy falters. I have family that live in Hungary that can tell you stories about what happens to the journalists in Viktor Orban. And we have some dear friends from Venezuela that will speak to a much greater degree on that topic later. So democracy is a fickle subject. And in order to get democracy right, it requires safeguards. And the founders would have known this. They wouldn't have known about the 1998 coup in Venezuela, obviously, they were mostly dead. But they would have known because they were very big students of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. Many of those nicknames that they used to write under in these debates, these were op-ed pieces. I mean, imagine getting an op-ed piece that is this refined in any of these newspapers today. It certainly wouldn't qualify. But they would write as their character nicknames would be developed based on Greek and Roman philosophers that they particularly loved. So they clearly understood this long history of democracy. And they knew that it was subject to some potential cracks in the helm. So the central question that they asked themselves is, what is the goal of government? What is the goal of the government? According to James Madison, it was to protect property. But according to most of the cohorts alongside with Madison, it was also to protect rights. Rights and property, that was their bread and butter. The founders believed that the states were laboratories for democracy where policies could be experimented with on a national level before reaching, or on a state level before reaching a national trial. And we're seeing this now with COVID. A lot of times people start to say, well, why is it that Jim Justice in West Virginia can be so draconian about some of his perceived lockdowns? Well, it's because in the 60s, a lot of what happened was states and localities gained a lot of power to deal with things like hurricanes and other natural emergencies. Again, this was a design specifically of the, the Federalist Papers. This was a system that was put into place specifically by them to be able to create this type of system. So there are a couple of instruments to this, right? So domestically, the first thing that we had to address, what was going on at the time, if you go back to the 1790s, what was happening was that there was a issue where we couldn't pay our armies, as our friend here alluded to. We were getting designs drawn upon us by many, many foreign powers. So we needed to have an effective military, but we also needed to have an effective revenue system to pay the military because of Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion and other issues like that. But the other problem that a lot of people don't recognize is that the American economy was in serious trouble. The American economy was, what had happened was the Continental Congress had authorized the printing of their own financial assets, dollars, and they didn't necessarily understand this concept called quantitative easing, where they would basically flood the zone with money, and it depreciated the value of the currency. There was a saying back in Pennsylvania, where my family comes from, that said, so-and-so, it's not worth the Continental. They still say it to this day. So as a result, you had to have an effective revenue system and a revenue collection system, specifically so that you could gain credit, so that foreign banks, such as the Bank of the Netherlands, the Royal Bank of the Netherlands, could attract could pour in foreign direct investment into the country. So that creates, and that sounds like a bunch of mishmash, hodgepodge, but that creates jobs, that puts food on people's tables. That's a very real threat, and it was a very serious threat at that time. The Royal Bank of the Netherlands, as I said, would not loan to the colonists. It was the only bank that we could consider loaning to them, because again, the French and the Spanish banks all wanted a piece of the pie, and the British banks were understandably a little put off by the fact that we'd just thrown them out of the country. Additionally, in order to constrain power, we need checks and balances. Checks and balances are a system that were designed by the Articles of Confederation, not by the Articles of Confederation, sorry, by the Federalist Papers. And it was designed so that, as Madison put it, ambition can counteract ambition. These people were acute understanders of the human condition. And they understood full well that in any sort of a system, you would have ambitious people trying to amalgamate as much power as possible to them. And so that brings up a point that my friend brought up earlier. He said that there's been a consolidation of power. Well, that was predictable to the founding fathers at the time. They knew that that was going to at least be attempted. That's why they set the system up. There has, but that's why holding our Constitution in such reverence is so important, because the left, and being aided by elements of the right, they have expanded government power to a degree that the founding fathers would have found baffling. So I'll tell you a story about this. We are, like I said, Californians. We are sort of anathema in California. We're gun owners. And there was one time where my dad and I were driving, and we got pulled over for speeding. And of course, we mentioned to the police officer, "Hey, listen, we're bringing the gun to somewhere." I don't remember. I think we were going to the shooting range or something. And technically, we crossed county lines. And the patrolman who pulled us over said to us, he said, "Listen, well, the rule in California is that you have to have," he said, "Where's your ammunition?" "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the rule in the state of California is that the ammunition has to be in a separate part of the car so that you can't access it even though the gun is already in a case." Now, I think that if Thomas Jefferson, or James Madison, or John Jay, or any of these, or George Clinton even, had heard that, I think their heads would have come off. But that's just one anecdotal evidence. But yes, there has been a huge accumulation of power at the national and the state levels. But the fact that this system that we have has been preserved and has withstood the pressure of despots, frankly, or despots, people who want to be despots, like on the national level, Woodrow Wilson, and on the state level, if anybody knows Louisiana, Huey Long is part of it as well. These were people that really wanted to amalgamate as much power for themselves as possible, and the Constitution has foiled them every single time. Power-hungry executives like Obama and FDR have run into similar problems, and socialists like Bernie and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have also been stymied and will be stymied by the exact laws that have been put forward here. This system of checks and balances, the system that preserves the integrity and recognizes, and the genius of the system that recognizes that men are ambitious, and that mankind is ambitious, and that we're going to try to check that ambition by balancing it off of each other. In terms of foreign policy, I'd like to circle back to another point. As our friend earlier stated, you had Spain, France, and Britain all over us, but no standing army, no navy, and no ability to pay any of the reservists that were within or militiamen that were within our grasp. So how are you supposed to conduct foreign policy? How are you supposed to defend your country? Marshall and I actually met at our master's degree program. We both studied statecraft and national security affairs, and there's a famous thing that I think it was Professor Tierney used to say to us, that there's four elements of state power: diplomacy, intelligence, military, and economic. So the only one of those that were afforded to our state, that's how a state conducts itself on the world stage, using those four elements. The only one of those four that were afforded to us under the Articles of Confederation was the economic power. We barely had any form of diplomacy. We had some shenanigans going on with Ben Franklin and John Adams, I believe it was, in Europe, but other than that, it was really not that official. There wasn't a whole lot of emphasis put on that, because we were trying to build our own country. We didn't have military power because of the fact that it was stripped of us. If we didn't have military power, we certainly didn't have intelligence power. So the only thing that we would have had was our power to conduct ourselves by an economy, by economic standards. And how is that going to impact anything? How is that going to defend, how would that have defended us in that time frame? But furthermore, how would that have played out on the world stage in history? How would it have gone how would the history of the world, as Ronald Reagan used to talk about, mankind's long climb from the swamp to the stars, how would that have gone if America's military power and diplomatic and intelligence power had not been able to stand up for the free people of the world? What would have happened to my family in Ireland? What would have happened to the blood of my friends in Hungary if we did not have George Bush saying that the Hungarian experiment is the proof that freedom can be delayed, but it cannot be denied? What would have happened if Ronald Reagan had not had the integrity and the moral power of his nation behind him when he stood at Berlin Gate and said, or at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall"? What would have happened? I shudder to think of what would have happened in World War II. The world is a significantly better place when America is strong. And the reality is that as important as the Anti-Federalists were, there is no case that they would have made the country strong if they had been able to promote the system of government that they wanted to promote. There was no ability for the country to grow into what it is today, into the country that we love, into the value system that we have, and then gain enough power and strength to be able to promote that abroad and keep the people of the world as relatively free as most of them are. Because every single person who is free in this world today is free because of the power of the United States. And we can talk all day about the legal system, but the moral impetus and the moral power of America is something that is truly, truly remarkable. And the only way that that would have ever happened is because of the Constitution, and that occurs because of the Federalist Papers and the Federalist Movement. So, with that, I would conclude that I would like to just again emphasize that every single person here should go home and pay homage to our Constitution, specifically because of the good that it has done in preserving and creating, ultimately, our unique American value set. And what has that done, not just for the United States, but for the people of the world? With that, thank you very much. God bless America, and God bless West Virginia.
All right, you're stuck back with me again, I'm sorry. Now, let's get back in our Wayback Machine, and we're back in Philadelphia, May 25th. We have finally a quorum, and we begin the deliberations. Okay? May 29th, 4 days after we start, Virginia comes up with the Virginia Plan. Interesting. Virginia comes up with the Virginia Plan, or it's called the Large State Plan. And Virginia comes up with this idea: 3 separate branches of government. The executive, we can't decide in Virginia early on, do we want an executive or do we want like a 3-member panel to be present, to be the executive? So that's still out there for argument, but that panel or that person would be appointed by Congress, not the people. The national government would have supreme power over the states, but only in the areas where the Constitution provided. And there would be two houses of the legislature. The lower house would be elected by the people, and the upper house would be elected by the lower house. The national government would have the power to veto state laws that were in conflict with the Constitution and national laws. Now, interesting. It's called the large state plan for a reason, right? Think the small states wanted this one? Both houses, by the way, of the legislature, here's what the problem was. Both houses of the legislature would be apportioned by population. Large states would control everything, small states not. So, that's the first one on the table. On June 1st, James Wilson from Pennsylvania proposes that we ought to elect the executive, not appoint him. And then the second day, June 2nd, he proposes the establishment of the Electoral College, which we have today, to select the executive. Both of those attempts were efforts to soothe the small states. Now, June 15th, we roll on June 15th, and New Jersey comes up with its own plan called the New Jersey Plan. And it is the small state plan. Here's what they thought. Okay, we'll have a plural executive elected by Congress for a single term, meaning maybe a panel of men. There would only be one House legislature, and every state would only have one vote. Now, why would they like that? That puts them exactly even and equal with the large states. So they go after that one. The judiciary would be appointed for life, and national laws and treaties would be the supreme law of the land. So now, we have the New Jersey plan, small state, and we have the Virginia plan, big state. Well, I guess you can figure out what happens there, right? So Hamilton, sneaky little Hamilton, Hamilton, 3 days after the small state plan comes in, Hamilton introduces the Hamilton plan, plan number 3. Now, this gets really interesting, because what's the real deal here? Hamilton comes up with his plan, and his plan calls, right out of the gun, says that he acknowledges, we acknowledge, that Britain has by far the best form of government. Is that going to sit well with people who just fought the Revolutionary War? No, I don't think he wanted it to, okay? He wanted the national government to be absolutely sovereign and supreme over all states. The state governors would have to be appointed by the national legislature, Congress. There would be 2 houses. The upper house, the Senate, would be appointed for life. The lower house would be elected by the people. The executive would be chosen for life. He would rule with a very strong hand, lots of power, and he would rule for life. And the executive power would have the power to grant pardons and negotiate treaties. See that today. All right. Now, we talked a little bit before about strategy, right? Is it a smart strategy? What was he doing here? His plan was so radical, there wasn't a chance that plan was going to pass. But what did it do? Small state plan, large state plan. With this, it's small state plan, middle plan, hardcore plan. It makes the Virginia plan seem very reasonable now. The Virginia plan's very reasonable because, oh my goodness, this guy's crazy. Now the Virginia plan we can rush to get away from Hamilton, right? We can rush to that plan. Now, was that really his idea? What he was trying for? We'll never know. He never said so openly. But aren't conspiracy theories fun? So, yeah, what was the deal? What it did do was put the Virginia plan sort of in the center as a compromise. So, the next day, June 19th, the New Jersey plan comes up for a vote, and is defeated. That leaves the way for the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan is defeated. The Virginia plan to be adopted. Now, the rest of the summer, we're working on the Virginia plan, basically. We're changing things and negotiating things, and you saw the Virginia plan wasn't what we have today, but it was close. So, there's what it is. So, June 16th, important day, at the convention, they came up with, okay, we're going to do 3 branches of government. We're going to have 2 houses. The lower house will be elected apportioned by the people. Large state, and this is called, the July 16th date is called the Great Compromise, in case you've all heard of that, I'm sure. So, the Great Compromise. So, we're going to have the lower house apportioned by the population, which means the big state plan, big state like that. The upper house would have 2 members, same for all states, small state plan, it's a compromise. And but the Senate would be appointed and appointed by the state legislators, and that was the case until the 17th Amendment, which was probably a big mistake for state rights. But that's a different story altogether. So, then I will say a dark spot on the Constitution, we have the North-South Compromise. And to appease the slave states, because where's the population base? It's in the North. So the slave states said, no, you're going to have way more people in Congress than we are, we can't have that. So the deal was struck that, okay, the southern states could count each of their slaves as 3/5 of a person to raise their numbers so that they would have an equal number, not equal, but a larger voice in the Congress. This is what was there. And that Congress could not pass any laws against importation of slaves until 1808. Gave them that breathing room. Again, my opinion, that's a dark spot to put on there. And to be fair, Congress did do exactly that. They had a bill ready to go at the end of 1807, and then 1808, they passed the bill, first thing out of the gun, no more importation, no more importing slaves. Now, had they dealt with it, we wouldn't have had to have the Civil War where 600,000 men died in a country of probably 30-some million at that point. 600,000 men died in the Civil War. No other war even compares. And that is conservative figure. There's more figures out today that says when you really count that everybody that died, that didn't die immediately on the battlefields, it's probably around 700 to 750,000. Now, don't know, but it's well over 600,000 no matter what. That doesn't include the 500 plus thousand who were wounded. That didn't have to happen, but that's one of the repercussions. So we always have to remember our choices we make, there's decisions, there's consequences to all those. So we need to think about that. So, here's a couple of really interesting quotes just for you at that time. Martin Luther from Maryland, talking about slavery. It is inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and dishonorable to the American character to have such a feature in the Constitution. George Mason, talking about slavery. Slaveholders bring the judgment of heaven on the country. They were both slaveholders. Isn't that fascinating? They wrote that at the time, what they believed, and yet they were slaveholders. Just phenomenal. All right, it comes to a vote. The Great Compromise comes to a vote. And the whole place, we talked about that, right? They were all singing Kumbaya and loving each other. The Great Compromise is passed by one vote, but it passes. Some of the decisions, real quick. Some of the decisions were made, we originally were to call this the National Tribunal. What's it called today? What did we settle on? The Supreme Court. It was called the National Tribunal. Now, here's a good one. Sort of a fun one. What are we going to call this executive? We've decided now there's going to be a single executive. What are we going to call him? John Adams wanted to call him His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same. Pretty nice title, huh? What did Thomas Jefferson say? It is the most superlatively ridiculous thing I have ever heard of. And what did we settle on? The president. So, we didn't go there. Now, interesting, Adams and Jefferson were allies at times, enemies at times. They were supposedly friends to some degree. If you read enough, John Adams was a fairly good friend to Jefferson. Jefferson was never a good friend back to John Adams. But what's fascinating with that, and you probably already read that, know that, they both died on July 4th within 5 hours of each other. Just fascinating. Fascinating. Our friend already told us that the United States, the Constitution gave the power to declare war to the Congress. That was the original intent, and it's still the case. How many times has Congress declared war? Officially. How many military conflicts have we been in? Depending on how you define military conflicts, well over 200. So, you see, that's not exactly what the founders would have thought the Constitution was supposed to be controlling. What other pretty interesting one? The issue of impeaching the president came up. And there was a big debate about whether you would have any mode to impeach the president. And Gouverneur Morris rises and says there is no need for an impeachment process because of the short term of the office. We don't need it. And Benjamin Franklin replies, and this picture of Benjamin Franklin, sort of head not really raised very much, hands together, quietly. He says, well, it's a way to remove tyrants without having to resort to assassination. Gouverneur Morris stops, backs down and says, he is persuaded by his colleagues' arguments, and therefore they put an impeachment process in. So, after a long, hot summer of debate and argument and back and forth, they tie all the things up between September 9th and September 17th. All the little details that are going to be tied up are tied up, put into a package. And on September 17th, 1787, they signed the Constitution. What is that? Not a math major, but 233 years ago today, is signed in Philadelphia. Now, it has to be sent to the states. They all have to debate it, and it has to be ratified. So that takes almost a year and a half. And on March 4th, 1789, the ratification is complete, and we have a government structure. We have a government that broadly lays out our rules of how the government is supposed to follow. To guard against tyranny, the founders designed a system of government. Not only, this is fascinating, not only separated powers. We say that all the time to understand. There's three separate branches and they're separated powers. Yeah, but that's not the genius. The genius is all three of those separated powers have to work together to get anything done. They can't do anything on their own. Yeah, they're separated, but they've got to figure a way to work together or nothing happens at all. Controls, checks and balances to the nth degree there. The founders didn't trust government. It's clear. But you know what? They didn't trust you either. You read, they knew quite well and they fully understood the fallen nature of man. So they put in, whether you're a leader or you're just a common man, they don't trust you. So they put in every possible safeguard that they could into the Constitution because they were afraid of what might happen down the road. They understood that. They understood human nature. They were going to grab for power. So they put every single check and balance they could in there to protect us, to maintain our freedom, and not only to maintain the freedom, that we might flourish in the freedom we have. At the close of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin gestured to Washington's chair, which sat by a window, to those around him, and he said, and I quote, "Painters have found it difficult to distinguish in their art of a rising or a setting sun. When you paint it, how do you distinguish if it's rising or setting? These painters can't do that. I have often, in the course of this session, and in the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at the sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it's a rising or setting sun. But at length, now, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising, not a setting sun." He was pretty satisfied with the final document. Very quickly, because my time is almost up on this one, if I get my times right. It's almost up on this one. But very quickly, we had, for the longest period of time, in the period between the signing of the Constitution, the coming into force, and the Civil War, we had presidents who pretty much realized what their role was and didn't try to garner power to themselves. They just didn't. They worked and did the executive branch, but they weren't really trying. Now and during that time, we had at least 3 strong presidents that we would say, okay, they really pushed the envelope a bit. Number 1 was George Washington. He got just about everything he wanted, but who's going to argue against the father of your country, right? It's just like, yeah, George Washington wants it, he's going to say no to that. So he was strong, but he understood precedence, and he understood everything he did was going to be an example for everybody to follow. So he controlled himself very, very, very tightly. He did not allow the presidency to get out of hand, because he could have. He was offered to be king, to be president for life if he wanted. And he was one of the ones that absolutely not. So, you have him. Then you have Andrew Jackson, who is a wonderfully interesting person. Andrew Jackson, just a sidelight there, Andrew Jackson, we're having problems with the Spanish sending the Native Americans over the border into raids into Georgia. So the president sends Andrew Jackson down to calm the thing down. What was Andrew Jackson's idea of calming things down? Well, he hung a British citizen and a Spanish citizen without any judicial process whatsoever, and he took it forward. Spain's happy about that? No. But he took Florida, and the president had to disavow all of it, but we can't forward. So, but that's Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson says, no. You House and Senate, you don't represent the people, you represent your little district. I, as President of the United States, am the voice of the people. Everybody voted for me, and therefore I am the leader of the nation. So that begins to change how we think about the president at this point, because he wasn't looked on as that. And Andrew Jackson said, yeah, I am. Now, that goes on, and we get to the Civil War, and we have President Lincoln, who is arguably, in my mind, he's right there with Washington. There's no question about it in my mind. Lincoln, and we have the problem with Lincoln's extra-constitutional actions. Now, they would be unconstitutional actions for anybody else, but since it's Lincoln, we say they're extra-constitutional because it's Lincoln, and we love Lincoln. Lincoln's goal, though, was to save the Union at all costs. He basically said, what good is it to keep the Constitution perfect and lose the country? We've got to save the country. And honestly, people, if you read enough about it, Lincoln practically single-handedly saved this country. His home cabinet, the country was saying, let the South go, this is getting crazy, stop the war, and Lincoln every single time would push the issue, no, we're one nation and we will remain one nation, and that's the way it's going to be, and he single-handedly saved us. So, the other thing about Lincoln is extra-constitutional is that he gave the power back as quickly as he could. He had to grab power and do this and do that with executive orders, things like that, because of the war, but as soon as he could, he put the power back. The problem with that is, it opens the door. Other presidents after Lincoln said, hey, look what you could do if you needed to do. So he set a precedent. I don't think he had a choice. I don't think the country would have survived without him making the decisions he made, but nonetheless. So we put him up there. Now, everybody likes George Washington and the ship. There's no question. But George Washington takes the country when everything's brand new and everybody's really excited. And if you ever done things with a brand new first time, that's pretty nice. So yeah, you give him a lot of credit. Lincoln comes in, the country is split in two, ready to dissolve, and fights and fights and fights to hold it together. You gotta give him a lot of credit. A lot of credit. So, and I'm sure West Virginia, we like Lincoln a lot, right? We have our statue right out. Lincoln walks at midnight right out the front. That's the front, right? That's the front. Yeah, right out the front. Yeah. So, the only important that we want to look at as far as Lincoln goes there is that's where it does begin to, for especially the executive to say, wait a minute, I can do things that former presidents didn't think we could do. We can get away with this. And that does open the door. Again, Lincoln didn't mean for it to be that way, but that's it. Okay, that's the Constitution of the United States. I'm ready to go again now, and with our next group. And that is... Yeah, Ruth. And then I'll talk with you one last time on taking it from the Civil War up to today.
Greetings. My name is Smoot. I'm the author of The People versus Socialism, a 10-count indictment for crimes against humanity. I also taught history at Potomac State College of West Virginia University. I taught at University of Rio Grande over in Ohio and a few other places. I also want to mention real quick that I have strong roots in the state in this area. My mother's family helped to settle Kanawha County. They helped to settle it, they helped to farm it, and they helped to fight for it. Whereas my father's mother's family came from Naples. Around the time of World War I, they settled in Barber County. And very quickly, my great-grandfather established businesses. He established coal mines, he established small businesses. So I want to reaffirm what was said earlier, that like Don King says, only in America, and that's because of our Constitution. It's not just a privilege, but also an honor to speak with you here today. I thank Delegate Marshall Wilson for his kind invitation. I appreciate all the support from everyone else involved today. As a former instructor, I like to lay the foundation before I make my point. So I want to start with the most general and work towards the specific, the most general. Some thoughts on constitutions and their history, and then we'll go right to the specific, which will be speaking of the origin of the Constitution of West Virginia in its early years. The origins of the structure of the United States Constitution go back much farther than the Founding Fathers. They go back well before the founding of even Rome. For a predecessor, a loose predecessor, we really have to go back to Moses, the liberator and the lawgiver of the Hebrew people. Under Moses, the Hebrew people, as we know, received two sets of laws. Moses passed to them the Ten Commandments, this ultimate, overarching, high-level law, to which all other laws must conform. They are broad and not detailed in the Scripture. Next, Moses granted God's chosen people a massive, and you can read them in the Bible for hours and hours, a massive set of laws governing day-to-day life. Again, none of these can contradict the Ten Commandments, just as none of our federal laws can contradict our federal Constitution. This model of law comes down through Puritan colonization. They saw themselves as the Hebrews 2.0. They felt persecuted in their native land of England under Queen Elizabeth I. They came over in the 1600s, set up society in a new land, concerned for the future, but confident also in divine providence. When they get here to New England, when they got to New England, they set up compacts to serve as the basic law of their new administration, to which other laws would have to conform, following the format of the Hebrews. When the founders adopted this format for the Constitution, they broke with British history, as well as with their other historical mentors from the Roman Republic, to craft a new kind of system. The Roman Republic's death inspired much thought and debate amongst the founders. It perished in flames when one political party in Rome set itself against the Republic's Constitution and fought its advocates in the streets of Republic cities. They wanted direct power without the constraints of law and a constitution, and drove their country into civil war. Julius Caesar is too often portrayed as a hero by those who felt that his might made right. But his emergence, as Shakespeare implied in the biographical play, killed off a republic that in its day was one of the few lights of relative freedom in the world. And our founders relied heavily on advice that came down through the centuries. Washington looked to Cato the Younger. John Adams found Cicero's orations a relief to his burdened mind. Chief Justice John Marshall, one of history's great jurists, drew inspiration from historian Livy and the poet Horace. Rome's failure led directly to James Madison and others debating on ways to avoid Rome's fate while building a secure and prosperous nation. Now, speaking of Madison, the architect of the Constitution believed, as most British at the time did, in a balanced government. From Aristotle, we learn about the three basic forms of government and how each naturally degenerates. Monarchy, seen by the Greeks as a positive form of government led by one individual, degenerates into the wrong kind of tyranny. Aristocracy, ruled by those who demonstrate the most merit, will degenerate into a corrupt oligarchy. And polity, ruled by the people, degenerates as well. The Greek idea of the word democracy was best defined up until about the time of Jackson, actually, as Madison's phrase, tyranny of the majority. Britain reasoned that since all these forms of government could fail through degeneration, having a system based on all three would sustain itself more effectively. When one part moved away from good government, such as Charles I in the 1620s, 30s, and 40s, or James II later in the 1600s, the other two elements could wrench it back. The British based their balance on a king or queen, the aristocracy, and the people. But Americans lacked two of these fundamental institutions, so Madison tried to find ways to recreate that balance. If you ever watched Schoolhouse Rock, as I think all of us did when we were kids, you know about the checks and balances between the three branches of the federal government. But less often do we think about the checks and balances established in the original Constitution between the federal government, the state governments, and the people. And this is why it's important that states establish and respect constitutions just as fervently as the federal. And this is also why we refer to our system as a republic as opposed to a democracy. History shows that sometimes, as was stated earlier, the more pure the democracy, potentially more savage the government. Athens, the classical world's most prominent pure democracy, turned its majority will on the war hero and philosopher, the great Socrates, who had dared to question the elites. Closer to our own time, post-World War I Germany endeavored to create the most democratic system in the world, the most responsive system to the majority will ever. Increasing strains and turmoil convinced this unrestrained electorate in the early 1930s to support the two parties most opposed to individual freedom and rights, and those would be, as we know, the National Socialists and the Communist Party. And both of these groups have battled to seize power and rule as tyrants chosen by the majority. Though the National Socialists won, I don't think there's any doubt that the Communists, as they had shown elsewhere, had they grabbed victory, would have been as murderous and destructive as the National Socialists. And their sibling ideologies, so it stands to reason. Our system as established is designed to prevent the violently evil, the destructively ignorant, and others who threaten peace from gaining full control. The admission of sovereign states with differences in size, population, culture, and ideals creates firewalls to prevent those pushing what Madison called improper and wicked projects from seizing control of the body politic in all society. Now, Madison, in Federalist 10, explained that the sheer size of the Union creates a diversity. And there's not just the states, but in regions of the country, even different parts of the states themselves. You have rights, privileges, and prerogatives that can prevent evil from spreading. And we see this dynamic at work in our own time. The diverse nature of today's union can prevent a motivated and destructive group and their fellow traveler movements from spreading their ideology of Marxism and destruction from one state to the other, because they realize that other states and citizens of those states will refuse to tolerate lawlessness. So they pursue the path of least resistance. Unfortunately, in those areas, it's the poorest and most vulnerable communities who suffer when their constitutional rights are not protected. They lose businesses. They fear to go out in the streets. It's those who most aggressively disparage our Constitution and its balanced protections that are engaged in destroying these neighborhoods and harming those who are least able to protect themselves. Our founders foresaw the potential for the current balkanization of our nation of competing and hostile interest groups, and saw that this could bring down the Roman Republic, or this did bring down the Roman Republic. But their genius lay in creating a system that would not submit or succumb easily to these overwrought passions, giving our nation a chance to soothe these and to return to reason. Now, those who wish to overturn our constitutional republic have up until now found themselves crashing their efforts against a wall of both tradition and reality. But some have claimed that our entire nation's history, heritage, and national tradition boils down to simply slavery and racial oppression. They seek to provide easy answers to complex questions, although professional practicing historians understand very well that Occam's razor works well in natural science. It's a poor substitute for working through the complexity of any nation's history. Instead, our nation's history on this issue has seen established injustice fall time after time, while some states provide the injustice of slavery a safe haven, even more objective to the institution. On Independence Day 1852, Frederick Douglass, a freed slave, rose to speak, addressing his words to the president. He said, "That I'm here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude, because the distance between this platform and the slave plantation is considerable." And so it was. Douglass escaped from a section of the Republic that, generally speaking, denied his humanity. He escaped to states that recognized both his legal right under the Constitution and his natural right as a child of God to speak his mind plainly and freely. In his speech, he recognized the gift of the founders to posterity, saying, quote, "They love their country better than their own private interests," unquote, and, quote, "stake their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country," unquote. After praising the founders and establishing that their work was honorable and just, Douglass urged his audience for not living up to their example. Specifically, he referred to elements of the Compromise of 1850, such as the Fugitive Slave Act. Step by step, detail by detail, he used the most powerful, acceptable, and appropriate language in his time to attack a society that continued to support, or at least failed to abolish, slavery. So let's go back to this diversity of the Federal Republic established in these sovereign states. This is what gave Douglass the opportunity to speak, and also the hope that it would fall upon ears willing to listen and act. He praised Northern churchmen also for advocating abolition, that he could share these ideals at all, and his criticisms, let's not forget, and much less that he found millions in agreement with him, cuts against the notion that the United States was only founded and perpetuated on a foundation of oppression. Instead, his words prove that he enjoyed the protection of the spirit of the First Amendment based on the recognition of his natural right to speak, at least in that section of the Union. We must also remember, too, that though Frederick Douglass's words thundered across a rhetorical landscape, mowing down slavery's defenders like grape shot on a battlefield, he also categorically refused to support John Brown's foray into violence when he was planning to attack Harper's Ferry. Now, only a decade after Frederick Douglass spoke, the nation was in a great civil war. The area John Brown desired to create his own country in was fighting for its own self-determination. That would obviously be our state of West Virginia. Now, separation began in sectionalism. And we go back to the original settlement of the region when it was still under control of Virginia, and we see so many divergences. Eastern Virginia was more homogeneous. It was dominant in people of English extraction, as well as dominant people who worshiped in the Episcopalian or Anglican faith, whichever word you want to use. When you go over to the mountains, and the valleys and the hollows of Western Virginia, you see a more diverse group. You see people whose ancestors had fled chaos in the German states of the Holy Roman Empire. You found people who were fleeing from the poverty of northern England and Scotland. You saw people who were worshiping the Presbyterian and Methodist faiths. As opposed to having large plantations and the supporting businesses thereof, they established small farms. They traded. They were developing free market style commerce in the western part of Virginia, despite sometimes some legislative bias from the eastern part of the state. In western Virginia, by the 1840s, you had nail factories in Wheeling. You had salt factories running in Charleston for decades by that point. And you had establishments growing all over the area. And a belief that if left unfettered, that they could thrive in these western mountains. You go to the eastern part, as you get closer to the Civil War, you have people who are opposed to the free market. A prominent intellectual from Virginia, George Fitzhugh, actually had studied Marx, and he was working hard to try to fuse the idea of European Marxism with aristocracy as a foundation to defend slavery. So even back then, Marxism was a powerful voice in favor of human bondage, one way or the other. Now, when you look at the free market, though, Adam Smith, Frederick Bastiat, some of its most powerful voices in favor of a free market, Adam Smith influenced our founding fathers heavily. Both of them spoke very, very aggressively against the institution of slavery. Now, as the Civil War opens, you have the fighting in West Virginia, you have the fall of Fort Sumter, and when you get to April, you have Virginia bringing together conventions to discuss and vote on secession. Western counties, of course, are remaining loyal to the Union. When Virginia votes to secede, the Western counties take initiative. They send delegates to get together eventually in Wheeling, and they form the loyal state of Virginia. Called by various names, but it was recognized by the president, it was recognized by the Congress as the legitimate state of Virginia, as opposed to the government that had elected, or that had voted and supported by its people to leave. So you have a state government for loyal Virginians in Wheeling. Why was that not good enough? That's a good question. Why did they want to go the extra step to create a new state? Well, part of it was, they looked back decades and they saw that Eastern Virginia really had no interest in developing Western Virginia, and they suspected that Eastern Virginians were holding down that development in favor of competitors in the East. But also, there's a little bit of self-interest here because in 1861, 1862, it was not really clear who was going to win the Civil War. And what happened to John Brown, by the way? Can anybody tell me what happened to him when he was captured?
He was mad.
He was tried for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, and he was hanged by the neck until dead. So Francis H. Pierpont and Carlisle and all these other folks, if the Union loses the Civil War and they can't make it to safe territory, they could be arrested, they could be tried, and they could be given the same fate as John Brown. So that's an issue as well. They also want to realize their vision for the potential of this area. Now, Lincoln had a dilemma in 1862 and 1863, as the people of the western counties and their leaders made it clear that they were determined to create a new state. This puts an onus on Lincoln. Congress to a little bit of a lesser extent, but Lincoln foremost, because there is a question as to whether statehood could be legal. In the Constitution, it says that you cannot create one state from within the boundaries of another state without that state's permission. Well, as far as Lincoln and Congress were concerned, well, yes, there is a state of Virginia that can give permission, but you have to go further because the Constitution says that a state has to have a republic form of government. And the question was, did the loyal state of Virginia, the loyal government of Virginia in Wheeling, that was only representing and only elected by the people of those western counties, did it form a true republic government? And going back to what you said, Lincoln did not want, he said that he did not want to see, in another situation, he did not want to see the Union go to pieces and the Constitution die if all the laws but one were being violated and the Union itself going to pieces. He'd rather save the Union. So he took that idea that he formed as he was trying to respond to the threats against the railroad and in Maryland and Baltimore riots, and took it and put that mindset into West Virginia. He says, yes, we will accept that Virginia is a republic form of government, the loyal state of Virginia. Yes, we will accept that West Virginia can become a state. And by the way, the third branch of government, the United States Supreme Court, kind of, sort of, indirectly affirmed this because there's a case decades later. Apparently, West Virginia, we weren't paying off some debts that we owed to Virginia. Virginia sued. The case went to the Supreme Court, but just in accepting both sides coming in, the Supreme Court was the third branch of government that validated that West Virginia is a legal, constitutional state. In 1863, as we became a state, we had what was first called the State Maker Constitution. Now, the state makers were Unionists. For the most part, they were Republicans, with a handful of old Whigs and Democrats scattered amongst them. And they were trying to separate themselves, define themselves as different from Virginia. And one of the things that they used to do whenever someone would suggest, well, why don't we do it the way Virginia did it? The response would almost always be, oh, you just want to go back to Egypt. Again, we're seeing the influence of the Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrews, on political thinking in the United States, and Egypt being, of course, in their minds, Virginia. So they adopt a township form of government. They kind of put the counties down to almost non-administrative government. They elevate townships as you have in Ohio and Pennsylvania. They go with 2-year terms for the state governor. And they also impose indefinite disabilities against anyone who had served in the Confederate government or fought in the Confederate military, which was a substantial number of people. They also, one of the things that they really strived to do, that they wanted to establish, they wanted a free public school system in West Virginia. Now, at this point, it was not a compulsory public school system, it was a free public school system. Because they wanted an industrial economy, they wanted a commercial economy, they wanted to move forward from the old days and the old ways. And they felt that this format, this setup would do it. After the Civil War, you had increasing pressure on the state maker clique who were governing West Virginia through that original Constitution to allow the former Confederates to vote. And by 1872, those disabilities had been removed. They surged onto the voting rolls. They all registered Democrat. But there's one thing that they did that was a sigh of relief to the state makers. You see, one of the biggest concerns of the state makers, one of the reasons why they kept the former Confederates from voting for so long, was because they were afraid that if those folks took over the state government, that they'd just vote to go back to Virginia. So, well, they fought for the Confederacy, didn't they? Why wouldn't they want to go back? Well, the state makers had done their job so well in the about 9 years that they were governing. They'd done their job so well that they had basically convinced everybody that yes, West Virginia was a good proposition. And also, they figured they'd rather run a small state than serve in a larger one. So they made some changes. They went to a 4-year term for governors, not re-electable at that time. They went back to the county government system. Townships were turned into districts. And each county did with those districts as they saw fit. I think only Preston County actually takes it seriously now, as far as I know. They accepted that vision, the commercial and industrial vision, and you could see it. It was one of their first leaders was Johnson Newland Camden, who was a right-hand man of John D. Rockefeller in West Virginia, oil and gas magnate. Also the guy who Camden Park is named after. But most importantly, they also accepted free public schools and that West Virginia needed to continue to exist. Now, one last point, and I just want to put it out there into your all's minds, because I mean, there is fear that at some point in the future, that some administration, at some point down the road, may try to work to try to infringe upon the rights of the people, infringe upon the rights of the states, infringe upon each of our natural rights. And there is really an Easter egg in our state law, potential possible Easter egg in our state law. You see, that when we became a state, we accepted the laws of Virginia that were passed before we left. One of those laws, or one of those acts, I should say, was the Virginia Resolution written by James Madison. In short, the Virginia Resolution it asserts the right of the state to declare a federal act unconstitutional. So that is something that is kind of nestled in the laws of Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky, because Kentucky had their own resolution. And it has never been repealed, it has never been fought. It's still kind of sitting there. So that's something to consider when we're thinking about our constitutional rights and how we may protect them, you know, if we see things get bad later down the line. Whether we speak of West Virginia or the West Virginia's Constitution or the United States Constitution, the job of these laws lies in protecting our rights and defining the limits of government. Respect for the Constitution means respecting those limits, especially in times when doing so creates inconvenience or even short-term pain. Our natural rights are gifts from God. Our Constitution exists to protect them from those who infringe on them. It also helps to fulfill our state constitution, as well as every state constitution around the country, every constitution of every sovereign state across the country. It helps to fulfill Madison's idea of preserving enough of that political and social diversity to ensure that our nation remains safe, free, and a true republic, if we can keep it. Thank you all very much for your attention. You all have a wonderful day.
All right. One more time and we're finished with me, I promise. Okay. Constitution lays out a complete set of instructions for the national government, right? It does it in about 8,700 words. That's all it takes. 8,700 words. It's amazing. In contrast, and I'm not picking on Alabama, but in contrast, because I like, well, I can't tell, I got my Ph.D. at the University of Tennessee, so no, I don't like Alabama. But at least Alabama football. In contrast, just to give you an idea, the U.S. Constitution is 8,700 words. The Alabama Constitution is 376,000 words to try to get everything crammed into the state of Alabama. The Constitution's been amended 27 times. The Alabama Constitution, this Constitution was it was only ratified in 1901. It's been amended over 900 times. So you see the genius in the U.S. Constitution. All of that put together and only amended 27 times in 233 years. That's extremely impressive. It's truly a marvel. But I don't think the founders realized what this Constitution was going to do, how that former government would allow a country to become as big and prosperous as we have become. They had big hopes, there's no doubt about that. They had big ideals. But I don't think they ever foresaw us becoming the hegemonic economic power of the world, the hegemonic economic power of the world, the hegemonic military power of the world, and leader of the free world. Remember, we were a third world country, and all attention was on Europe, not us, at that point in time. And yet, that's what this Constitution has allowed. Just to give you an idea how small our country was. In 1790, as the Constitution takes effect, there were about 4 million people in the entire country. Spread out across the country. The government, the executive branch of government, was made up of 3 departments. Department of War, Department of State, and the Treasury. That's it. That's the government of the United States as far as the executive goes. Now let's take just a second, because this is just fascinating. The presidency. The office of the president. How many staff did the Congress allow him, the president, to have? Think about the size of this government, how small. How many aides did the president have? None. The president had not one staff member. He's running the entire country by himself as far as the executive part of it goes. Now he's got the cabinet, things like that. There's none. They're allowed to know. And that stays in effect. Well, in fact, in 1792, Washington can't control. It's just too much paper. So he hires his nephew to be his secretary, and he pays him $300 a year. And back then, that was a good salary. But he pays him $300 a year to have a secretary, because Congress won't give him one. John Quincy Adams, Thomas Jefferson, all of them complained at the time. You can't keep up with the correspondence, let alone try to come up with ideas. You can't answer the mail. I don't even have a secretary. So, nothing is done until 1857 with President James Buchanan, and Congress gives him 1 aide. They pay for 1 aide. In 1857, the presidency has 1 aide. That goes on until 1929. We don't even fathom how small this government and our country wasn't. It just hard to even get in your mind. How could you operate the presidency with that? 1929, Herbert Hoover says, I gotta have help here, guys. You're gonna have to give me some staff. Congress gives in, and they give him 3 secretaries and 1 aide. 4. The press, as they do always, went crazy. And an article in the American Mercury, December 1929, states, it was to be expected that the appearance in the White House of a big executive should see the accompanying enlargement of office quarters, expansion of equipment, and massing of secretarial help. In bygone days, the president had a secretary, good, bad, or indifferent, only one. But that was the era before the super administrator, before efficiency came to the White House. Now there's a whole machine gun squad to handle the work. 4 aides, 4 people in the presidency. So it's hard to really fathom how small that gets. How much could the president actually even do? Not a lot. Now, Congress wasn't doing a lot then either. The country was much smaller. People didn't expect the government. In fact, that was the case. Now, even in our mindsets, if you're a conservative and the government should be limited, we still expect the government to step in and fix problems. That was not the mindset. Mindset was, that's not the government's job. We got to figure out how to do this ourselves. That's the government's not supposed to do that, which is not a bad thing at all. In fact, because we see what happens when we change our mindset. But 4 in Hoover, it continues to grow exponentially. They had no idea what was going to happen with the next president. After Hoover, FDR. And boy, does the world turn on its head, or at least the United States. So, everything changes at that point. In fact, most scholars divide the country into pre-Herbert Hoover and pre-Roosevelt and post-Roosevelt. That's called the modern era. It's the traditional era up to Roosevelt and the modern era from Roosevelt on. Okay. 4 in 1929. Under Richard Nixon, how big was the presidential staff, the executive office of the president? 5,700 people working just for the president. Do you see that expansion? Now, because of the scandal of Watergate and other presidents trying to separate themselves, that number's dropped. So the average today is about 2,000. The president has 2,000 people working directly for him doing what he wants. But back in the first part of the century, in the 1900s, it was 4. And before that, there was none. So it's hard really for us to get a good feeling of what that government looked like. It didn't do what it does today. And because of that, it didn't put the pressures on you that it does today. It couldn't. Today we say that the traditional literal interpretation of the Constitution is under attack. And it is. Our Constitution is under attack constantly. But now we're going to look very quickly at when did that begin? 1950s? 1960s? No. The attack on the Constitution actually started very, very early. The attack on the Constitution started in the 1880s with the Progressive Movement. And it has built slowly at first, growing and growing and growing. The progressives said publicly at the time, the Constitution is outdated and it's inefficient. You can't get anything done. Well, that's how the founders wanted it, to be very slow, methodic. So absolutely, yeah, that's true, but that's the way the Congress wanted. That's what the founders wanted, and that's what had kept the country in its same form for almost 150 years without any problems. They wrote openly that the Constitution had to be swept aside. Now, we needed to keep it as a framework, but all these checks and balances, all that stuff has to be swept away. We've got to change it. And they wrote openly about it. The scholars did, some of the leaders wrote about it, and until they realized all of a sudden, the American people don't agree with us. they're not on the same page we are, and they like the Constitution, and we better take this on the down low. So all of a sudden they stop attacking the Constitution and start rah, 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 which we see today, the Constitution, while at the same time undercutting it every chance we get. We'll do it quietly. We won't do it publicly because the people won't stand for it. At least not right now. We're going to change it. The progressive period is actually the launching point for modern liberalism that we have today. So they needed to keep it as a framework, but they wanted to completely overhaul it. By the early 1900s, 20-some years, 30 years, it took them about 30 years to get the ball up and rolling. They were in full swing, and they had a huge influence on the Democrat Party. Presidents like Woodrow Wilson, big progressive. But they also had some influence in the Republican Party. Theodore Roosevelt, which we all, young Teddy is pretty impressive, and I can't help but like young Teddy. Older Teddy was a major liberal. To the point of writing publicly, I have his article on nationalizing private property. You don't see that about Teddy. Now, one of the things you gotta love about Teddy, one of the things you do, because you know he was all for vim and vigor, he would call in the cabinet for a meeting made up of a bunch of old white men, and what would he do first? Everybody out on the lawn for calisthenics. Made them all go out on the lawn and do jumping jacks before they go into the cabinet. So you gotta like him to some degree, but realize that. All right, I'm gonna give you a couple of examples. What was happening at this time in Europe? Early 1900s. What's happening in Europe? Socialism, communism, but socialism is really advancing. It's moving rapidly. And the progressives look over there and say, wow, look how that, wow. And so the majority of some progressives actually wanted socialism, but the majority did not want socialism. They didn't want to make America an outright socialist country. What they did want to do was take a lot of what socialism was doing and apply it to the United States. How can we get things done? Because they can get things done so fast. They don't have all these checks and balances, and they can just get things done. So how do we do that? How do we bring efficiency here? So I'm going to give you a couple examples. They determined, all right, the separation of powers is it makes doing anything too slow and too gradual, and so we've got to do something about what can we do. Now, watch this, because this changes everything. This is how the government has grown the way it's grown. I'm going to give you two. There's multiple. They hit it from every angle they could hit it. But you create a regulatory agency. That's how you do it. Now, I'm not attacking all regulatory agencies. Some of them do good things. Some, maybe. But the regulatory agencies are good, to some degree. But what's the genius? And you got to give them credit. What's the genius about regulatory agencies? Regulatory agency creates the law, it enforces the law, and it adjudicates that law. We just swept separation of powers off the table. They can do all three at the same time. That's one of the huge advancements. Just to give you an idea of that magnitude, the Congress of the United States passes about 300 laws in a session every 2 years. The bureaucracy in this country creates over 3,000 new rules and regulations every year. More than sometimes, right at 10 a day. 10 new regulations hitting every single day. That's been the average since the 1940s, 50s. So, and the Supreme Court has said that all of those regulations that the agencies create are equal in authority as if they were a law passed by the legislature. See how that goes? So that's very, very, very important for us to understand that. Just give you a couple, and honestly, no one stops this. It continues to march forward. The only president who ever did anything before Trump, the only president who ever did anything was Ronald Reagan, and the best he could do, he was death against regulation, but the best he could do was slow the growth, not total, slow the growth of regulation by 25%. Like, sorry, I move around. I told you to move around. Excuse me. All right. He slowed it by about 25%. Now, you can like Trump, you can hate Trump. I don't care. That's not what I'm here for today. But Trump has stopped the regulations. It's dead in the tracks. And he's the only president who's ever done that. He started off saying, if you remember, for every one new regulation, you got to take 2 off the books. What's that actually work out to? For every one regulation you take off the books, put on the books, so far he's taken off 16 for each one. So, you may not like him, but in this area he's been very effective. Just to give you an idea, though, from the philosophical point of view and from the danger part of it, Federalist 47, James Madison says, accumulation of all power, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Well, that's what we've done with these agencies. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. Where? In the bureaucracy? No. In the Congress. They can make laws. The Constitution says nothing about agencies making anything. Constitutional problem, John Locke talks about this. From the philosophical point of how the Constitution is rebuilt. John Locke says, and remember the founders relied heavily on him, says the legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands. For it being a delegated power of the people, those who have it cannot pass it on to others. And that's exactly what's happening. Now, one of the things that we do here, when we think of government, in my class I walk around all the time. That way I catch people who try to go to sleep on me. When we think of government, we think of the president. We've been trained that way in school. The president, the Congress, and the courts. Okay, that's a few thousand. It's a few thousand people. I use this as an analogy. The iceberg, have you ever know what an iceberg is, right? Well, you see the top of the iceberg, but what's below? Massive mountains. What sunk the Titanic? It wasn't the top, it was what was under the water. That's what sunk the Titanic. So, just to give you a feel for the bureaucracy. There's a few thousand people which we look at as government. When we say government, we only think about presidency, Congress, courts. There's a few thousand people there. In the federal government alone, how many people in that bureaucracy running the day-to-day operations of this country? Over 3 million. When you add states and local governments, it's over 24 million people in the bureaucracy. That's where the day-to-day government is, guys, not in the top. You have to watch that. Now, the other one we've already talked about here, the Commerce Clause. One of our gentlemen talked about it. Commerce Clause, rightly understood, is not a problem. The problem has been misinterpreted and misapplied over and over and over. All the Commerce Clause says is that the Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with Indian tribes. That's all it says. But, what have we done? During the Progressive period, this was one that, wait a minute. Until the Progressive period, the Commerce Clause was never used by Congress to enforce, for justification for any laws. After FDR, the Commerce Clause is used continually to pass any kind of legislation. They just use it as a boilerplate. The Commerce Clause says we can do this. Does it? Does it say that? No, it doesn't. So, the Progressives used this as early as 1940s. They began to build these regulatory agencies from the power of the Congress, of the Commerce Clause. It's not there, guys, but nonetheless. All right. But then the stars were about to align. Or was it the perfect storm? We had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and the election of FDR. One of the most, well, probably the most influential president we've ever had. Getting things done, that's all I'm saying. Good things, I didn't say that. Getting things done, he was good. The demands of the country grew, and with that, the power of the presidency and the Congress and the government in general grew, and the country began to, government began to try to solve more and more and more and more and more and more problems. Not that they did it well, but they did. So, as I told you before, many scholars break the whole history of the U.S. up into the traditional period before Roosevelt and the modern period after Roosevelt, because everything changes at that point. In fact, I tell my students there are only two answers to all political science questions. FDR, and it depends. You're good on those. If you got those, that's all you gotta have. In fact, I had a student once who did not study for an exam, and so he thought he'd try it out, so no answers he didn't know, he just wrote FDR. And he failed the exam. So, because, no, that's not legit, but. Okay, so FDR promises this country a new deal. And that sounds like really good, right? New deal. Sounds good like hope and change was a good deal. But it's a new deal. Well, to do that, he had to get the Constitution out of the way. Because the stuff he wanted to do was clearly unconstitutional. So what do you do? What do you do? And did they know they were doing that? A lot of people, yeah, well, they weren't deliberately trying to sabotage the Constitution. Oh, yeah, they were. Here's what Rexford Tugwell, he's the chief architect of the New Deal. Here's what he says. To the extent that these New Deal policies developed, they were tortured interpretations of a document that intended to prevent them. They knew exactly what they were doing. Another example, Roosevelt decided he wanted to devalue the dollar. He's just going to devalue the dollar for various reasons. Quote here, this is a little short. Have I the legal right to do this? He asked a group of senators in the Oval Office. He was talking about devaluing the dollar. Mr. President, Thomas Gore of Oklahoma, who opposed the idea, you could go out into the street right now, knock down an old man, drag him into the White House, take his clothes, and sell them secondhand. It would be just about as legal or constitutional as what you're planning to do. But it doesn't matter. You can do it anyway. Roosevelt roared with laughter and approval and did it anyway. Now, for the first term of Roosevelt's, four elections, for the first term of Roosevelt, he actually, the Supreme Court stopped him. The New Deal the policies were stopped because the Supreme Court kept ruling them unconstitutional, which they were. So, he begins a war with the Supreme Court, and he calls them the 9 old men, right? He calls them those like 9 old men, they don't even know what they're doing. So he comes up with this idea. He looks through the Constitution doesn't say there'll be 9 justices. Doesn't give any number at all. So he says, So he puts a bill forward that every time a Supreme Court justice reaches the age of 70, which most of them were already there, he can appoint an additional Supreme Court justice. Now, the Congress, even though it was Democrat controlled at the time, even then they were like, this is clearly a power play from the presidency. No. So it failed. He didn't get that. In fact, it actually damaged him in certain degree because his own party was like, you can't do that. So, but what he did was by 1941, he had appointed, 1947 first. Let me give you 1937. 1937 is called the Constitutional Revolution. Constitutional Revolution, 1937. What happens? Roosevelt keeps getting knocked down 6-3-5-4. Unconstitutional, unconstitutional, unconstitutional. You can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. The Constitution says no. In 1937, 2 justices flip. And all of a sudden, anything Roosevelt wants goes 6-3-5-4 his favor. And it's all constitutional now. Now, again, I talked about conspiracy theories. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories about what happened if those 2 justices flipped. What happened? all kind of conspiracy. Well, he got something on them, and they had to do what he said. Others have said, no, they were already starting to lean that way, and they just finally went over that way in 1937. Whatever the case, it's called the Constitutional Revolution in 1937. By 1941, though, he has appointed 7 of the 9 justices, and it's called what? It's now called the Roosevelt Court. And basically, whatever he wanted to do, Supreme Court backed him. So what was, until 1941, or 1937, for what was always deemed unconstitutional, all of a sudden becomes constitutional. The court no longer just looks at the literal interpretation. Well, but that means this and that. And that. Does it mean that? Read the Federalist Papers. Read what the founders were writing. No, it clearly doesn't mean that. But nonetheless, all right. I want to give you one example just to jump forward. This should scare you a little bit. I think they can scare the Supreme Court. They scared themselves. In 1985, the Supreme Court in Garcia versus San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority said, they declared, the Constitution has no a priori or guaranteed. The Constitution has no guaranteed definition of state sovereignty. Technically, that's true. But we talked earlier. What is the Constitution trying to limit? The national government. It's not talking about the state government. So, no, it doesn't say that. It's not geared to that. So, you see how you get to twist the interpretations and make them say things that they were never intended to be. It also says that there is no discrete limitation of the object of federal authority. There's no control of federal authority found in the Constitution. That's what the document is. It's a limitation of their authority. And here's the kicker. There is no protection for state powers found in the Constitution. Have you read the 10th Amendment? All powers not given to the national government belong to the state government or the people. Nope, that's not it. There's no powers. Now, the only power a state has, according to the Supreme Court in the 1985 decision, was you get to elect your national representatives, and they can vote the way you want them to. That's the only protection a state has. It has no protection whatsoever except in electing your representatives, Congress and the Senate. Now, to be fair, they've not pushed this. I think they screwed themselves with that, because that is so opposite of what the Constitution is saying. So, we've talked about this. Our Constitution needs to be defended, and we need to be ready to defend it. Because there are forces out there who want to degrade the Constitution, to get what they want. It's not really the Constitution, it's the Constitution in their way. And they need to get it out of the way so they can get what they want. So I want to tell you that it's really up to us. We've got to start doing differently than we have been doing. How do we protect the Constitution? Who should protect the Constitution first? The elected officials? Yeah, they should. But who do they work for? We've got our heads all messed up there too. It's like they're our bosses. No, they're not our bosses. They work for us. If you owned a company and you had a manager running it and he'd say, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to do the way I want to, what would you do? You'd fire him and put somebody in who'll do what you want. That's where we are. Now, I'm not talking about revolution, I'm talking about the ballot box. When they're not doing what we need, when we are clearly degrading the power of the people, we need to fire them. So, ultimately, it's our responsibility. We need to stop looking at government in any of those lights. It's our responsibility to do something about this. Now, what do? Vote? Yeah, but voting every 2 or 4 years is not going to do it. It's just not going to do it. You need to be in contact with your elected officials, county, state, local, national, it doesn't make any difference. You need to be in contact with them on a regular basis. And you need to hold unashamedly the moral and religious convictions that you have. And you need to let them know that this is what you believe, and this is what you want, and that you're watching. I can tell you something. I was a city councilman here in Charleston. I think you mentioned that. I was a city councilman here in Charleston years ago. And it's the strangest thing. People don't pay any attention to what you're doing. In fact, this is what's the power of the people. If you want to use it, if we had 10, 12 people come to the council chambers on any issue, it was like, we better pay attention. Here's a group of people that really, 10 or 12 people. No one ever comes. No one's listening. So we would probably bend over backwards for those 10 or 12 people who might have been totally wrong with what they're doing. But wow, they're interested. We just sit there and don't do anything. And I'm sorry, our elected officials know that. So, the Constitution probably does need to be changed from time to time, right? It was a document written in 1787. Yeah. So, how do we do that? The Constitution provides in it a way to change things. Amend the Constitution. It allows for that. It allows for changes. It allows us to grow and to change and to do. You amend the Constitution. We've done it 27 times. We should do that rather than reading into the Constitution things that are clearly not there, and reading out of the Constitution things that are clearly there. If you want to change the Constitution, amend the Constitution. Why don't we do that? There's two really good reasons. The groups that won't do that, the groups that are changing the Constitution through other ways. Number one, it's a slow process. It takes too long. You got to get it passed through the Congress. You got to get the states to agree to it. You got to get all this stuff. It's too cumbersome. We don't want to do it that way. That's the way it was set up. And why did we set it up that way? We don't want quick change. People's emotions get involved. We do things at the spur of the moment. No. We want a slow process. And if it's a really good idea now, it'll be a really good idea 2 or 3 years later after we have the votes necessary. If it wasn't a very good idea, then we didn't want to do it anyway. So that's number one. But that's not the scariest one to me. To me, this is the reason. I want you to do this, and I don't have the power to make you do it. But me and my group, we want it done, and we want you to have to comply, and we don't have coercive power, but the federal government has coercive power. So, we can't take the chance that you and the states might not agree with us. We'll do it through regulatory agencies. We'll do it through Supreme Court decisions. We will have the courts do it for us because they can make you comply. That's why we don't want to amend the Constitution. The people who will make all these changes, every citizen, every state, the states wouldn't go along with it. So how do we do it? We'll get the courts to do it for us. We'll get these agents to do it for us. And we'll get what we want and force you to do what we want. So if we want you to save the puppies, well, I'm all for puppies. I like dogs. And you don't want to, well, we'll get the government to make you. Whatever we want the government to do, we're going to make you do it. That's the problem. So, John Adams, close here just with a couple of quotes. John Adams said, and this is important, about who we have to be as people if we're going to be free. If we're going to be free and have the rights that we were given and pass those along, Adams says this: we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to govern any other. Edmund Burke, one of my favorite philosophers, political philosophers, from England, Ireland, says this, and it's a famous statement, you've heard it, it comes from Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. That's all it takes. As long as you keep good people quiet and sit down, we can do anything we want to do. I'll leave you with a quote from Benjamin Franklin. And it was already alluded to by a friend from Ripley. There's a little old lady standing outside the Independence Hall on the last day of the convention, and Benjamin Franklin comes out the door in the last session and starts down the stairs, and the little old lady calls out and says, "Mr. Franklin, what sort of government do we have? What sort of government do we have?" And Franklin looks at her and says, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Thank you. And we are ready.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. Very pleased to be here today. Today's it's a very important day in my life. My wife's birthday. Congratulations, sorry. and it means a lot to me. A couple of weeks ago, my good friend Marshall, state delegate and independent candidate for governor of West Virginia, sent me this text message. Would you want to celebrate with us the Constitution Day? And it was like, wow, does this really exist? So sure, why not? Of course, it's an honor, and I'm very pleased to be here. It means a lot to Venezuela who lived away from his country because he had to, who initially didn't know what to tell you, why you went there. Hey, I actually have this text message. Let me see if I find it right here. What do you want me to tell? And I wanted to tell my neighbors the ramification of allowing or Constitution to be ignored. I was like, I got it. I know. I believe that. So, this will sound more like a recipe. This will sound more like a reading agenda. Because that's really what happened. That's really how socialism controlled my country, destroying the wealthiest economy in South America. That's really how these guys down there in Venezuela were able to destroy the fourth. In 1950, Venezuela was the fourth richest country of the world over China. And it was destroyed by some guys that they didn't love the country. They love themselves and they have a project. They have socialism, they have Marxism, they have Leninism, they have communism. That's what they are. And they use the Constitution, and they abuse the Constitution to create a new state. And this country has had one constitution and 27 amendments. Venezuela has had 26 different constitutions. The one that we have now was written and passed in 1999 after Chavez was elected in 1998. He came with a plan. He put the plan in place and he delivered. He was proposing large changes to Venezuela, and you may see in the news what happened and the reality of the Venezuelan people, and he delivered. He brought poverty. He brought equality, everybody down here, not anyone up there, as we all want. This country was, we have one constitution, the United States, and it's not perfect. I have heard from you guys, but certainly was written and it was based on making sure that the government and any government is controlled. Teddy Roosevelt was stopped by this constitution. Many others are, because it has to be respected. It cannot be ignored. Now, Chavez, former President Hugo Chavez, and his followers referred to the 1999 document as the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic. It was built on that dream of the Bolivarian Republic. Chavez was elected, as I told you, Chavez was elected president in 1998 while the 1961 Constitution ruled. Chavez's plan was to promote a deep transformation of the country, and do we tell, he the leader, as I just told you. He got almost the entire world to acknowledge that that constitution they were creating was the greatest one, due to the number of human rights enshrined in that document. It actually was. It was the best bill at the moment, but it included so many people and so many sectors of the population that were not considered before. When you come from a country that had 26 constitutions and all of them were vastly different, that tells you how small countries, how Latin American countries, newer, younger economies are susceptible to being controlled, and you know, when you have the determination that the people who wrote this constitution, Jefferson, Lincoln, they built this country, to make sure that you build something that will last forever, and based on principles, you see that a lot. You see how small countries cannot make it happen. Largest changes. The first one was the change of the name of the country. It was moved from Republic of Venezuela to Bolivar and Republic of Venezuela. More branches, 5 branches in Venezuela on Venezuela's constitution. First, the executive, the presidency, the legislative, the National Assembly, which is called Congress, a synonym for Congress, National Assembly, the judiciary, the electoral branch, which is electoral power, and the citizens branch, which is the citizens power. The electoral branch is headed by the National Electoral Council, and is responsible for overseeing the elections in the country, nationwide, the municipal, the counties, states, and the federal elections. The citizens branch is constituted by the defender of the people, the chief public prosecutor, and the comptroller general, okay? Responsible for representing and defending the citizens in their dealings with the powers of the Venezuelan government. And the legislative branch was changed from bicameral to unicameral system. Dr. Haynes, you mentioned something that caught my attention. In 2009, okay? Oh, because there was only one election before, and it was switched to a 6 years old, to 6 year long presidential terms, subject to a limit of 2, so it can be re-elected. One re-election was allowed in that constitution. That was never new for a Venezuelan constitution. In 2009, the term limits were abolished through a referendum. Chavez set the constitution for staying forever at the office. In Venezuela, the vice president is appointed by the president, okay? And the vice president works together with the National Assembly. So I can tell, as a president, I can tell who is going to work together with the National Assembly, which is our Congress. So it's kind of the president telling the Congress what to do. That sounds weird. That doesn't sound normal. It doesn't even make sense. But that's what was happening over the years, and that's what he was able to do with his new constitution. They changed the Venezuelan judiciary system, they reform it. The judge will be appointed now by the National Assembly, who was controlled by the Vice President. So it's kind of complicated to explain. And the healthcare system. That was a big Trojan horse for socialism in Venezuela. Okay? Chavez offered free and quality healthcare as a human right guarantee to all Venezuelan citizens. The Hugo Chavez administration attempted to fulfill its constitutional obligations by implementing the Barrio Adentro program. And Mr. Robert McGeehan and I were talking about this a little earlier, because through these mechanisms, through this program, they opened the door for Cuban spies to come to Venezuela, acting as a medical staff, as as doctors, as physical therapists, as anyone. And they came and established a network in Venezuela for controlling who lives in every single place and who and what they do, what they live for. You know, they know because they were inside the community. Even in the farthest point of the country, there was one of these cells, one of these little places. And they knew who you were. Venezuela was paying for this service, let's call it that way, was paying Fidel Castro every month thousands of dollars for each of them, each of these doctors, spies doctors, and establishing full control of the society in every single aspect. With all these changes, he put his people in the right position. He was solving his puzzle. He secured the control over the majority of the Venezuelan National Assembly, or Congress. They appointed the Supreme Court judges, had political control over National Electoral Council. President already had a lot of power. Chavez was able to control all the branches. And the cherry on top was when the National Assembly, that he led, approved an law that will allow President Hugo Chavez to enact decrees related to an infrastructure, transportation, and housing and public services, between others. The enactment law, as you may know it, is a measure that permitted by the Venezuelan Constitution that concedes power to the executive branch for a determined period of time to approve decrees that permit the implementation of critical policies which would otherwise take too long to enact due to bureaucratic obstacles. This power was later renewed multiple times. In short words, do Mr. President, King of Venezuela, do whatever you want for the longest time you want. Do whatever you want. We're here to serve you. In January 2005, they began openly proclaiming the ideology of socialism of the 21st century, something that was different from his earlier Bolivarian ideology. And the Bolivarian ideology was more on the social democratic nature, and it had emerging, elements from capitalism and socialism together. Does that sound familiar to you guys? That very constitution would not fit anymore. They needed more power. The socialist democratic dictatorship plan was now bigger and bigger. In 2007, government removed their mask, and Hugo Chavez attempted to include 69 constitutional amendments to be voted in a referendum. The first one, to abolish the presidential term limits, allowing for indefinite re-election for the president only. Not for governors, only for the president. Expanding social security benefits to workers of the informal economy that never before declared taxes. Taking the autonomy of the central bank, giving the control to the president of the International Reserve. With no permit, with no authorization, just do whatever you want. This is your big bank, the central bank of Venezuela. Reducing, of course, you need to throw some candies and you need to make it attractive for people. Renew the working week, the maximum working week hours from 44 to 36. Reduce the work day from 8 to 6 hours. Lower the voting age from 18 to 16. Increase the presidential term from 6 to 7 years. Allow president to declare an unlimited state of emergency. prohibit foreign funding for political associations, allow public funding for political associations, and banning discrimination based on sexual orientation. This was his plan, his proposals. At that point, I had a chance to be part of the student movement nationwide. Once he presented this was socialism, taking democracy. Imagine that you grab your constitution, that a country can grab their constitution and scratch all democracy, and write down socialism. That's what she was doing. And at that point, me and a bunch of other kids, back in 2017, we were just kids, 2007, we went out and we got together and we traveled all over the country, and we decided that we were fighting that. He lost that election. That referendum was the only election he lost, but he found a way to make it back. He found his own way to make it back and to make it valid later. I will tell you. We went out as a student movement to the streets and all over the country to push and fight for their future, freedom and democracy. I had a chance to be one of them, defeating him with ballots and liberty dreams. In December 2005, 1 month after losing that election, he was fighting back once again. This time he made it to a decree, referendum, and then he passed it in 2009. El Comandante, what they called him, dies in March 2013, and his revolution was intensified. There was a chaos politically, socially, and economically. That was once one of the most prosperous societies and economies in the world. His preferred successor, that you may hear about him, takes the office, Nicolas Maduro. And they call an election. They take their time while he started building some leadership. That was the moment when he had to leave the country. 21 out of 42 national, I didn't mention that, but I'm a founder of Voluntad. Voluntad Popular is a political party of President Juan Guaido, and I was one of the 2 leaders of my state, and at that point, there are 24 states, 48 total for the whole country. That was called national team directing the political country, the political party. When I left the country, 48 out of 21 were in prison. They were detained, they were in prison, they were facing charges in front of the courts, the socialist courts. They called to an election in 2013. They controlled the electoral system. They tricked the election, and Maduro won the election, of course. Who takes care of the voting? It's not a citizen act like here. It's not a citizen event like here. They have, yes, there are citizens seeing that the process is followed, but also the military are the ones controlling the boxes. Controlling after you have the election, okay, I grab the box, we're going to take you for counting. Okay? And they found that it was easier to use electronic technology to make it better, easier. And they switched the whole voting process to electronic. That you were voting here, and a computer in Caracas in the capital was taking your vote and counting. And at the end, we tell you what happened. Easy to win, of course. In 2000, even with all this, in 2015, the opposition, the Democratic Unity Coalition, wins the control on the Venezuelan National Assembly. For the first time in 16 years, we won 113 out of 167 total congressmen in the country. And at that point, after 16 years, we were riding over a huge wave of poverty and popular discontent. Maduro couldn't live with losing an election. First time in 16 years losing an election with the size of, sounds pretty bad for him. So what they did, they called to the Supreme Court, the Venezuelan Supreme Court, to act on the name of the Congress. They announced that the Supreme Court was taking over the functions of the National Assembly. The court quickly walks back of the decision because of the international pressure. But the event sparks a month of anti-government protests that ultimately leave more than 100 people dead. In July, Maduro calls for a referendum. He was boycotted by the opposition to approve the creation on an all-powerful legislative body called the Constituent Assembly. The Venezuelan Constitution in 1999 was created by a Constituent Assembly. They called to a new Constituent Assembly because they lost the majority of the Congress, of the National Assembly. This majority had enough members to be able to change, according to the Venezuelan Constitution, to change the Constitution. Because they couldn't take it, they created a parallel Congress. This parallel Congress was supposed to write up a new Constitution. They didn't. They just wanted another Congress. Now, Supreme Court reacts to that fake Congress. The presidency reacts to that fake Congress. The electoral system reacts to that fake Congress. The military obeyed that last mentioned fake Congress, and they called to a four-time election. And Maduro won the election, of course. That's how Maduro was elected the last time in May 20, 2000 something. Okay, the last election. He was elected through a fake, illegal, illegitimate process. The Constituent Assembly didn't have the authority to call for any election according to the Constitution. In addition to that process was organized in violation of several political rights. Basically, due to the unconstitutional ban declared to the main political parties and leaders, Leopoldo Lopez, Enrique Capriles, they couldn't be candidates. Okay? They brought one of his buddies, previous, actually was the governor of my state, and previous former member of the Socialism Party, and he was appointed as the candidate against Nicolas Maduro. So they created the perfect scenario for the world to believe that there was happening an election in Venezuela. As a result, Nicolas Maduro cannot be recognized as a legitimate elected president in Venezuela. Because of this, he's usurping the presidency of Venezuela as a not elected president in charge. Now, the Venezuelan Constitution does not regulate what to do. It's not clear. It's the first time. This is new for us. What to do when a non-elected president is exercising the presidency after the inauguration day. The most similar situation is regulated in Article 233 of the Constitution. According to that article, if the president cannot assume the presidency on inauguration day, the president of the National Assembly assumed the presidency as an interim president until a new election is called. This is why Guaido, the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly, is now recognized by over 60 countries, including the United States. Thank you, guys. As the real legitimate president of Venezuela, because of this mandate of the Constitution. It's not because he was just thrown there. Now, there are two obstacles to the implementation of that article. First, the rule of law was dismantled over the years. It's not possible to enforce the decisions of the interim president. There's no way. No one answers back to him. Second, the presidency is now being exercised by a usurper. So, it is a theater place. It is a very sad situation. While political chaos continues, Venezuelans are still suffering lack of food, the worst humanitarian crisis of the history, comparable now only with Haiti. Many in the media have blamed Venezuela's humanitarian crisis to corruption, mismanagement, falling oil prices, and the U.S. sanctions. Anything but the rise of socialism is what was once the wealthiest country in America. Corruption and mismanagement were the direct result of increased government control of the economy. There are three main implemented policies by Chavez since 2019 that produced this crisis. First, the nationalization of the private industry, controls of the currency, and the fiscally irresponsible expansion of welfare programs. Have you heard about this? One of Chavez's first actions was to start nationalizing the agriculture sector, supposedly reducing poverty and inequality by taking from rich landowners to give to poor workers. From 1999 to 2016, his regime robbed more than 6 million hectares of land from the rightful owners. All this under the Constitution they built, violating everything. Nationalization destroyed the production, affected industries, because the government has no capacity to run thousands of businesses. They're not made to. They're not supposed to be running businesses. The profit motive is to make money, right? So that makes it inefficient. Instead, government officials face incentives to please voters by selling products at a very low price and hiring more employees than necessary, even when that's a wrong business decision. Venezuela's food production dropped 75% in 21 years, while the country's population increased 33%. The population increased 33%. Your food production compared to 21 years ago is 75% less. What can you expect? 6 million Venezuelans are out of the country. I'm one of them, and 3 more. That's how they destroyed the country. After agriculture, the regime wanted more, and they nationalized the electricity, the water, the oil, the banks, the supermarkets, the construction, and many other crucial sectors. All these sectors, the government increased payrolls and gave away products at very low cost because they had money to afford that. They had a budget based on a $35 per barrel, oil barrel, and they were selling for $110. They created this fund, okay? 35 was for the budget, the country's budget for the year, and the other $65, $75 are going to Mr. President's pocket. That's how Chavez traveled all over the world, convincing everyone that Venezuela was the greatest economy of the world. He traveled all over the world. He bought friends. He earned the friendship of big leaders, and he built this big name around him. And he had the opportunity to call that the vehicle, Mr. President Bush here in an animation session. He felt powerful, and he had a lot of money. All the sector government increased payrolls. Yeah, that's why the country jumped into countrywide blackouts, no electricity, no power, water service interruption, falling oil production from 3.5 million of barrels daily. Venezuela is now, as of last week, producing 333,000 barrels a day. From 3.5 to 3.5 million to 333,000 barrels daily. With the Chavez implemented foreign currency control scheme, where the government set an overvalued exchange rate between the Venezuelan currency and the US dollar, they gave millions and millions only to those close circle and politically affiliated with them. Naturally, a black market for foreign currency emerged, and corrupt regime members and lucky individuals were assigned cheap dollars, obtaining very large profits. The socialist regime also implemented price ceiling on hundreds of basic products as beef, milk, toilet paper, and artificially low price. More people were willing to buy these products, but private factories are still left. They would just have to leave the country. The extremely low prices and reduced production resulted on shortage of products that forced them to stand in line for hours while supermarket employees and the well-connected obtained the products they needed. But perhaps the most harmful part of the Venezuelan socialist project is a part that the international media and leftist figures use to praise it most frequently: the welfare programs. The socialist regime created the missions aimed to tackling poverty, illiteracy, healthcare, and more. Expensive welfare programs and massive public works projects provided ever-growing opportunity for still greater corruption. Printing money to pay for endless state programs unsurprisingly led to high rate of inflation. Welfare programs that were supposed to help poor people, actually increase the cost of living. Foreign currency control that aimed to reduce inflation only increased it and allowed a massive corruption. And nationalizations that would have given power to workers only left them unemployed and hungry. As of now, 6 million Venezuelans left the country. As Venezuelans, we have learned over the last 21 years of socialism that free things come at a very high price. We will continue to fight in every scenario. That's why I'm here. My wife's birthday, but I'm here. This means a lot to me. I think this is the first time Venezuela is in West Virginia, state capital, telling you the truth of what really happens in Venezuela. We will continue to fight. That's what I'm here for. I really love your quote, Robert Me. The world is better when the United States is stronger. I will say that from you if you let me do it. We the people must stop socialism. We must. There's no other option. Let's continue to spread the truth about Venezuela, please. And we will try the best to awake down there, but we need you guys. Thank you.
So my name is Barry Holstein, and honestly, after listening to everybody else, I'm just realizing, you know what? I'm just a common man. That's what I am. In the beginning, And I know that sounds like a weird way to start a closing section. But in the beginning, probably one of the most recognized three-word phrases ever in the history of man. Everybody knows what that is. Everybody knows where that began. And that, as part of the Christian faith, has launched action for centuries. Since that time, there's been another three-word phrase that's created a country. It's sent men to war, and it's been an example of freedom and liberty to the world. And that phrase is, "We the people." A phrase that begins one of the most important documents written by man for securing liberty from the ambitions of tyrants. The beauty of the Constitution is its brevity and simplicity. It's written for me. It's written for the common man. It's written in such a way that it doesn't take a lawyer. It's written in such a way that they can't pull the wool over your eyes. You can read it. You can understand it. It's written for me. It's written for you. It was designed for we the people. And again, as I stand here today, I'm just really humbled to be part of this event. I truly am just a common everyday man. I grew up in rural West Virginia. I was the son of a coal miner who didn't finish the 9th grade. I simply wanted to do better than my dad. And I simply wanted to make sure that I did what was necessary to make sure my kids did better than me in this world. That's all I wanted. And isn't that what's great about America? Equal opportunity. My kids have all the chances in the world, and I've done everything that I can do to set them up. They could be the next Jeff Bezos. They could be the next Thomas Sowell. They could be the next Elon Musk. But most importantly, they can be whatever they choose to be in this country. At the age of 18, I chose to join the Army. I didn't do it for glory, and honestly, I didn't do it for patriotism either. I just did it to get the GI Bill. I needed some money to go to college. That's what I wanted. And I got it. But little did I know that taking that first step out of my comfort zone would make a profound change in my life. It would change who I am, how I thought, and my actions moving forward. I took the oath of enlistment, which included the phrase, to support and defend the Constitution. It doesn't say to defend myself. It doesn't even say to defend you. It says defend the Constitution. That's how important the Constitution is to every single one of us. That our military must swear an oath to defend it above all things. I experienced a lot during my time in the military. I had opportunities to be a drill sergeant, a platoon sergeant, and a company first sergeant. But it was my combat time in Iraq that changed me. I realized then, really, that I have taken freedom and liberty for granted. I saw firsthand what living under tyranny and oppression will do to a country. I saw firsthand what living under tyranny and oppression will do to its people. I was blessed by some Iraqis who, at the risk of their own life, helped me perform my mission to help them. But I was also frustrated a lot by some Iraqis who felt like the journey was just too hard and too dangerous. Too many perceive security as more valuable than liberty. Does that sound familiar? In the book of Numbers, we find a similar scene. The Israelites, who had been removed from slavery in Egypt, are now rebelling against Moses, who had led them out of Egypt, out of slavery, because things just didn't immediately turn into all milk and honey, right? Even though they were provided with free food, they actually said, would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt. Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. They were saying, let's choose a leader and go back to slavery. Freedom isn't worth it. They preferred to go back to slavery where they knew their fate, instead of doing the work and taking the long journey that their families, their children, their grandchildren would live in a land of freedom. Does this sound familiar? It seems that too many today are asking to go right back under an oppressive king. Have we not enjoyed the liberty that our founders fought for? Have we not built the greatest nation on earth under the protection of our natural rights in this Constitution? Why then are too many calling for a king to rule over them? Why trade liberty for security? After coming back from Iraq, I knew that I had to do something. I didn't know what, but I just knew I had to do something. Just like that step out of my comfort zone when I took the oath of office, I realized that I needed to take another step into my community. I decided to start a 501c3, grab up some community-minded folks, and just get to work right in my own community. And since then, I've created another nonprofit that's focusing on sex trafficking in our state. I knew I had to do something. But my next big step has been the most impactful. And that was the one into politics and government. Our Constitution calls for our laws to be passed by a group of representatives that we select. No one else selects them. No one else puts them in the seats that I'm sitting here looking at. We put them there. We select them. And those are the people we want to represent us and we're asking to write or change our laws. When I did that, what I found was that they are just men and women from their community. I could talk to them about my concerns. I could work with them on changing laws. I realized that, honestly, there's nothing special about them. There's nothing to be afraid of in approaching my representatives. But these men and women, these elected officials, need reminding that you are their employer. They work for you. They need your guidance. Why would we shirk our responsibilities to our employees that we hired to do a job for us? If you owned a company, would you simply let your employees just do whatever they want? I think that answer is no. So why then are we ignoring our employees right here in this building in the capital of West Virginia? We must step up and we must get our hands dirty. I'm giving you today this call to action. 3 things that I'm asking you to do. Number 1, vote. You must exercise your right to vote that's given to you. Not just in the general election, not just for some party. What your legislators do has great impact on your life, and you know that. You probably complain about it, but you have to do something. Every year, a group of folks meet in this room. The one I'm standing in right now, they meet here and discuss how much of your money they're going to take, and how much of your money they're going to spend wherever they want, and what new regulations on your life they will enact. You actually have input into this through your vote, but you have to be an informed voter. I'm guessing practically everyone that listens to this or sees this has a smartphone. In this little device, you have the knowledge of the world. You have the knowledge of what my friend before me was talking about that occurred in Venezuela. You have it. If you want it, go look it up. It's there. Why then not use it for good? Use it. Find out who your representative is. Find out how they're voting. Because again, They work for you. If you love liberty, you'll take the time to do research of your candidates and not just vote on them on some rumors that you hear on social media. What you've also found out recently is that there are no unimportant elections. How many thought the Board of Education elections were important before the last couple of years? They're all important. Second thing I want to ask you to do is engage. Every single elected official is accessible to you. Every single elected official is employed by you. Every single elected official answers to you. Know who they are, know their phone numbers, know their email addresses. Put them in that smartphone that I know you have. Put them on speed dial. Get to know them. Contact them and tell them what you care about. Better yet, come to this building during session and go to their office. You'll see them. Talk to them face to face. Get to know who they are. They'll listen. If not, just like any other poor employee, you can fire them. If you love liberty, hold your elected officials accountable. Their job is not to grant rights. Their job is to protect your rights. And sometimes they forget that. Number 3, serve. Each person has a sphere of influence. Your job, your community, your friends. If you want to preserve liberty and freedom for your kids, talk to those around you. Think critically every single thing that you hear, every single thing you hear on the news. Everyone, let me rephrase that. Everyone has an agenda. It's up to you to decide what that agenda is and whether it increases your liberty or increases your subjugation. The pendulum will swing, but if it swings too far towards subjugation, it'll break. We cannot let that happen. We must take matters of liberty and personal responsibility seriously. We cannot continue to abdicate our responsibilities. And I'm going to stand here and make some statements, and I'm going to say that right now in America, our churches are abdicating their responsibilities. Our men are abdicating their responsibilities to their families. It must end, and you and I can stop it. If you love liberty, you will serve your family, your friends, and your community. Serving those around you gives them standing in their life, so that when you talk to them about the effects of tyranny and about the benefits of liberty, you have standing in their life, they'll listen to you. But you have to build trust, and trust comes through service in many times. So I encourage you to serve those around you. So remember, as I'm leaving you today and we're closing this session out, I'm asking you to do those 3 things: vote, engage, and serve. Liberty is not won by a coward or a sloth. We have to be engaged. Today is a day set aside to remind us just how important the Constitution is to our daily life. I hope you walk away with greater understanding, a greater love, and a greater desire to defend the Constitution and the liberties it was designed to protect. You can do it. And why can you do it? Because we are the people. I pray that you'll be willing to take a step outside of your comfort zone and fight for that liberty in some small way. May we never trade liberty for security, and may we not walk away from our responsibilities to support and defend the Constitution of these United States. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for being here. Sorry about that. Thank you all for being here, especially our presenters, Dr. Haynes, far exceeded my expectations. Thank you, sir. Sincerely appreciate you. We're going to talk to Pastor Harmon in just a second. He's going to close us out. Luis, thank you very much for bringing your experience to life here for us. And I want everyone to be very clear on this. What he expressed for us is our future unless we stand up. If you study the history of the world, governments like ours, societies like ours, always fall, and they are always destroyed from within. And it is always through sloth and ignorance and greed. And I say greed by those who would confiscate the work, the wealth that is actually created by others. Thank you, sir. It's a real honor to have you here. Mr. Dave, Robert, thank you. I really appreciate the fact that you were prepared to go toe-to-toe with the champion of liberty of the West Virginia House of Delegates. I would like to claim that title myself, but I cannot. Delegate Patrick McGeehan had established that position long before I got here, and the man has never backed down. And I tell you what, I actually had that argument, the anti-federalist versus federalist, on the back deck of the house that we shared in my first session as a delegate. And I'm not sure I won it. I was on the Federalist side, and I'm not sure I won it. So you did well standing toe-to-toe with them. And I thank you for coming all the way out here. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your friendship and the wisdom you brought today. Dr. Smoot, sir, it's an honor to be your friend. And I think I told you a while ago that you far exceeded my expectations as well, which is saying a lot because I've known you for years, and I am very aware of the capabilities that you bring. Not only the capabilities, but the depth of knowledge and your love for West Virginia. You've taught me more about this state than I've known about any other place that I've ever lived, and I'm profoundly grateful for it. And the way that you gentlemen were able to bring it all together. And of course, I thank Delegate McGeehan, who had to leave because he had a class. He's working on his Ph.D. And the way you gentlemen were able to bring the philosophical, moral, and historical basis of our Constitution together was stunning. And Luis, the way you counterpointed that with the Venezuelan constitutions and the various chaos that we've had to deal with, but keeping in mind at all times that there was a time when Venezuela was one of the top four, was the fourth wealthiest nation on the planet, and it was a free country. Gentlemen, I am profoundly grateful, but more than each of you, and I hope you'll forgive me for this, I want to thank First Sergeant Barry Holstein. I've been in the trenches in politics in this state with this gentleman. I've never seen him back down, and I've never, ever once seen him be disrespectful or unkind or ungracious, but he never, ever backs down because he knows what he's talking about, and he knows what it will cost us if we don't stand our ground. I am profoundly grateful to each of you, if I may. And I Pastor Mooney, I'm going to thank you too, but you're not done with your job yet. So thank you for being here. I am profoundly grateful to you because I know you well enough to know the perspective that you bring, but most importantly, I know that you know the guy you're talking to when you pray. Thank you, sir. I'd like to call Pastor Harmon up, and we are going to meet in the courtyard, if you guys know where the bell is. We're going to meet out there. We've got sandwiches being brought in. I hope that some of you actually brought food, but because that was the invitation. But if you weren't able to bring it, don't worry. We've got plenty of sandwiches out here. I do want you to be aware that a couple of news agencies in the Charleston area contacted me and said they'd like to speak with our attendees because apparently it's gathered some attention. If any of our presenters would prefer to not engage in that, I will do what I can to run interference for you if you believe that's necessary. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we're not going to put you on the spot. You came here to bring a message, you brought the message. Whatever else is going out there is for us. So, Pastor Harmon, thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me today and just letting me be a small part of this day and what we've celebrated here. real quickly, as I was sitting here, Luis got finished, and he sat down at the daughter's thing and they hugged him. I don't know, that may not mean much to you, but you could tell how proud they were. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I was over there about to cry, because that's why we're doing what we're doing. That's why he's fighting for what he's fighting for. And so we need to remember that. Now I'll do what I'm supposed to do. Joel chapter 2, verse 13 says, "Rend your heart and not your garments. Now return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and relenting of evil." Let's go to that, Lord, in prayer today. Dear Lord, today as your word instructs, we approach the throne of grace with boldness, but we also come with brokenness of heart to say, Abba, we need you. We need you as individuals. We need you as a state. We need you as a nation. We've strayed from the path that was laid out before us. We've followed false gods of pleasure and influence and wealth and many others. Today we turn away from those things and turn to you in repentance. Lord, we ask for wisdom and divine guidance. When we are tempted to abandon the heritage of godliness, liberty, and freedom that our forefathers gave us, may we be reminded of the sacrifice that they made. And Father, may your grace abound to us. May we understand the cost that previous generations paid so that we could be free. May we stand in the gap and not squander what they and you have given us. Most of all, may our lives glorify you in all that we do. Lord, your word declares that blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and Father, we desire your blessing today. I ask your blessing on each person assembled here, on this time of fellowship to follow, and on each one as they travel home. We thank you that you hear us and answer us. Now I say to each of us to receive the blessing of the Lord. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be your children and the product of your work. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will cause your enemies to rise against you to be defeated before your face. They shall come out against you one way and flee before you seven. The Lord will command the blessings on you in your storehouses and to all to which you put your hand. I bless you today in the matchless name of the uncreated one, Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Thank you very much for attending our first Constitution Day at the West